The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
I'd like to call the board's workshop into session, and I'm going to apologize in advance that I have a board-related meeting I have to go to in the governor's office at 3, so I'll leave at that point, and I will turn over to the vice chair, Andre, to move the workshop forward from that point. You can see in the agenda we've organized the workshop into 5 items, and we will be starting out with this overview of exemptions and emergencies, which Member Casari and I were just saying is going to be good to get a comprehensive overview of this and get our mental arms around all of this. So Ms. Borjas will lead us through that. So our attention is yours.
Thank you, Chair Gillis. Demi Boris, board staff. And before, just so that folks kind of know what to expect today, the agenda has been organized based on feedback from the board, and then under each of the agenda items, the board provided staff with questions that the staff attempted to answer. And so first, again, we'll be starting with an overview of exemptions and emergencies. And then just again, so you know what to expect, the reporting requirement in statute pursuant 4589 will be discussed, after which agency and public comment. And then later will be draft recommendations, and finally the report content. So beginning with the overview, the first question that was posed to staff or research item was just to discuss the origin of 4584 and how it's been amended over time as new exemption ideas have been brought forth, and a timeline. So a 4584, there were exempt activities provided for in the original act between 1973 and 1994, more or less. The legislature amended this section of the Public Resources Code 5 separate times, each time adding new specific exemptions to the general requirement of a THP. These amendments occurred in 1975, 1987, 1989, 1992, and 1994. In 1995, there were 9 separate exemptions, more or less. In 1994, approximately, the legislature created the first structure protection exemption for the cutting and removing of trees within 150 feet of a structure. In 2001, the legislature amended 4584 again in response to commentary regarding the abuse of less than 3-acre conversion exemptions, and constrained that exemption further. In 2004, the legislature created the LaMalfa Forest Fire Prevention Protection Act of 2004. In 2007 and 2008, the legislature amended again 4584 to extend the forest fire prevention pilot, or the forest fire prevention exemption, required that RPFs consider habitat elements, required sample marking, required a few other things, and included the Lake Tahoe region. In 2013, the pilot project was created, and that raised the size of allowable trees to be harvested from 18 inches outside stump diameter to 24 inches outside stump diameter. In 2014, the second structure protection exemption was created for operations between 150 and 300 feet, and that was again to extend that fuel break concept around structures. In 2016, the legislature amended 4584 again to allow the extension of the pilot project with some revisions. and that included raising the diameter from 24 inches to 26 inches and expanding the geographic area. In 2016, the legislature added the oak woodland management exemption. So that's just to give you an idea over time how the legislature has amended 4584, which again, in essence was there from the beginning in the Act. So then the next question that was posed to staff is, can the board establish exempt activities absent specific statutory authority? And to the extent that the board can grant exemptions, it must be within the scope of 4584. And that was pursuant to a court decision, Epic versus the Department of Forestry in 1996. That was when the 3 acre, there used to be an exemption that the board had, which allowed timber operations on less than 3 acres. And that wasn't specifically provided in the statutory of 4584 and was found to be not okay. So essentially only the legislature can provide exempt from the act that they created. Now what's interesting is that in 4584, there's a bit of contrary information, and that is that in the preamble, it talks about upon determining that, this is again in the preamble of 4584. Upon determining that this exemption is consistent with the purposes of this chapter, so that's the legislature is putting that on the board to determine consistency with the purposes of the chapter. The board may exempt from this chapter or portions of this chapter a person engaged in forest management whose activities are limited to any of the following. Now, I've been involved in numerous enabling of exemptions, and we never look at it that way. We kind of look at it as soon as the legislature does something, we are going to enable it. But pursuant to that language, it seems to suggest a bit otherwise. However, in a few specific exemptions, G, and this is in 4584G, which is the less than 3 acre conversion exemption. In I, which is the forest fire prevention exemption and the forest fire pilot project exemption, it says the board shall adopt regulations. So that's, in my reading of it, seems a bit in conflict. And then also in the oak woodland management exemption, it says shall adopt. So the reason I bring this up is because when we get to the recommendations, it might be something that you ask the legislation for clarity on. So moving on to another question that was posed to staff is, what rules and requirements are exemptions and emergencies actually exempted from? Considering that they often have tighter requirements, more limitations, and prohibit in lieu operational practices available with standard regulatory approach to timber harvest. So the way that our preamble in 1038 reads is that, so what the board has decided to, exempt, because the legislature again says the board has the ability to exempt it from part of the chapter, all of the chapter, so what the board has decided is the plan preparation and submission requirements, PRC 4581, and from the completion report and stocking report requirements 4585 and 4587. So in 1994 and 1995, the board amended 1038.1 to replace all other provisions of the Forest Practice Rules and Forest Practice Act with all operational provisions of the FPRs and FPA. So again, this was a initial attempt to go through the history. So what these documents serve as, and I hope they will serve as all the supporting material, will be as, for example, we need to go into because the question came up, I know, earlier, and what does the operational provisions of the forest practice rules and FPA mean? Well, perhaps we can go back to that rule making file and take a look at that. At least we won't have to reinvent the wheel entirely, is what I hope. And this can be said of everything everything moving forward. It is such a valuable exercise to go back and look at history, because in my brief experience with the board, it has been done before. It has been discussed before. So then the next question that was posed was, what is the difference between exemptions and emergencies? So the authority from 1038 is born from 4584, which has been made, it's interesting to see the trajectory. It's been made increasingly more specific over time by the legislature. I mean, just look at the forest fire prevention exemption and the forest fire pilot project exemption and the Oakland management exemption. You look at those and we hardly change them at all. We almost adopt them and enable them completely as they're written in the PRC. So that's been an interesting trend. So again, 1038 is born from 4584 and 4628. 4628 is it's the statute associated with the right-of-way exemption. 4628, and I'll talk about 4592 in a minute, which is the authority for the emergencies, has remained little changed since the inception of the Act. 4584, just discussed, has been modified over time. So the authority for 1052, which is the emergency section, and is born from 4592, which is broad. And the board has used that broad authority to create quite a few emergency notices and interpretations of that. So now more specifically, with regard to 1038s and 1052s, exemptions and emergencies, an RPF is required for the preparation of all emergencies, and on the contrary, for exemptions, RPFs are not required on some. And we'll talk about that more, but in general, RPFs aren't required on Christmas tree, they're not required on the 10%, they're not required on the 0 to 150 structure, the structure protection exemption, they're not required on the biomass exemption, and they're not required on the drought mortality exemption on 20 acres or less. So also emergencies are not constrained to specific conditions, where, like, for example, most of the exemptions are constrained to what we call, the 1038E 1 through 10, where you're not allowed to operate on certain slopes, not allowed to build road, not allowed to do a lot of things. And, but whereas emergencies are not constrained like that. Although exceptions, alternatives, and in lieu are not allowed in general. So the next question that was posed to staff was to describe the process once the legislature makes the law. So with regard to the legislature, it's interesting because the legislature, so does the legislature do environmental analysis, for example? And the legislature don't have to do the environmental analysis. But when it comes to us, we do. So now I am ready to direct your attention to workshop 1.1, which is the spreadsheet. Before I do, does the board have any questions for me about the material that I have covered thus far?
Questions?
Just to refresh my memory relative to can the board create exemptions, or do they all have to come from the statute? 1038K, drought mortality, Was that one that came, we thought about, and we said we need to do this to address the situation, that didn't come from statute, is that an example of that?
Actually, all exemptions have to come from statute, and that one did as well. And it came from the dead and dying part of the statute. The dead and dying part of the statute has borne many exemptions.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a great point, no, I appreciate that, so it came out of 4584, but it came out of something that was existing.
Yes.
That enabled the board to make that.
Yes.
that decision.
That's correct. The constraint of the 10% has never been in statute. It's a creation of the board. And so the board equally had authority to create 1038K, which doesn't have the 10% constraint. Okay, so.
Interesting. Any other questions? Thanks.
Okay, so now what I thought we would do is we would just go through, and again, I hope this is referenced for you in the future, for all of us in the future going forward. The chart is organized such that you have the permitting option, and 895 is in here because there are certain definitions that were adopted specific to certain exemptions or emergencies, and so that's why 895 is in there. Also 929, which are the archaeology rules, some archaeology rules specific to emergencies were adopted, so that's why that's in there. So you have the permitting option or the rule, you have the actual rule section, you have the statute section, the authority essentially, the history of it, and RF is the rulemaking file, so if ever you decide to go to the rulemaking file yourself and look deeper, all of those are online. You have the expiration that's more relevant to some of the newer exemptions that we've that the board has adopted, and the motivation. This was the attempt to capture the impetus, the climate, what was happening at the time the exemption was occurring. And then the total since the data was tracked. This was information that CAL FIRE provided and has been broken down in the different charts in this document by region. The total is for all regions combined, and the charts break down the different regions. And that's again since the data was tracked. Okay, so I'm going to direct your attention to page 2 of it, and we'll start with Christmas trees. We'll do Christmas trees, dead and dying, and the fuel wood or split product. So Christmas trees has again changed little since the inception of the act. You can see that is the line in blue. I have, Curtis, can you put the region map back up for us? Yeah, so just to give you an orientation as far as the regions go, so the region 1 is the coast, region 2 is the North Cascades, region 3 is the purple area, if you will, for the southern area, and then region 4 you see is the Central Sierra. So that's so you'll and you see on the axis there the regions, and then the different colors for the different exemptions. So Christmas tree just is most used in regions 2 and regions 4. Okay, so moving on to the harvesting of dead and dying. This is also been around since the original act, but again was constrained originally by the board to 10% of dead and dying per acre, and then the fuel wood and split products which were originally unconstrained as far as amount of volume, was constrained after there was a period of heavy harvesting of fuel wood and So that's what brought around that constraint of the 10% on the fuel litter split products. And so I have nothing really more to add on the A, Bs, or Cs. If you have any questions before we go to the next set of exemptions. So the next set of exemptions are on page 3, and now these are the structure exemptions. And this is the 1038C and 1038C6. And this is the structure protection exemption, which, and the legislative intent behind those was to provide a fuel break for, and I can look at the, yeah, so the legislature created this exemption to make it easier for homeowners in wildland areas to maintain a fuel break of up to 150 feet around their residence. And that was similar to, that was a similar impetus to the 150 to 300, which they did many years later. And if there's something you want me to cover, like specifically, so again, the motivation was to provide a fuel break, but if there's something specific you want me to be covering, I'd be happy to do so. There's something I do want to mention that you may consider in your rulemaking in the going forward, and that is many of these were created by emergency rulemaking, which, having been, again, involved in several emergency rulemaking, requires a lot of staff time. And more than half of these are created by emergency rulemaking. And so we'll get to this later, I hope, in the workshop, but I just want to bring that to your attention, that a lot of these are created originally by emergency rulemaking and then are made permanent. So we talked about the structure protection exemption. Now we'll go to the substantially damaged timberland. So what this is the unmerchantable assault log exemption. And this is again, falls under that 4584C, which is the dead and dying, so that's the authority. And the board had the authority to, because the legislature doesn't constrain the amount of volume, the board made unmerchantable as saw log unconstrained by the 10% as long as the RPF has designated the land as substantially damaged. And the reason behind that was okay, I'll tell you. So this is 1038D. And the reason that it was, the impetus behind it was so considerable acres of California, this is from the problem description, this was passed back in 1993. And so considerable acres of California state and private timberlands have been destroyed or significantly damaged by wildfire. And you'll hear these themes come up again and again. Insects, fire, have been damaged by fire in recent years. Timberland owners are faced with somehow utilizing or otherwise disposing of dead timber material in order to minimize waste of timber resources and to facilitate site preparation for future timber operations. Under current forest practice rules, the timberland owner can file an emergency notice and/or an exemption notice under 1038B with the director in order to remove dead, dying, or diseased. To illustrate the extent of fire damaged areas, it goes through them several fires, Fountain Fire, Old Gulch Fire. It talks about how many acres are covered. Then it talks about the constraints of the emergency notice being constrained only to 60 days at the time. And it talks about dead and dying being constrained to 10%. So in light of those two constraints, so that the landowner can prepare the site for the next crop, this exemption was brought into play. And this might be an area for consolidation, because if the board does decide to keep the, because some of those constraints are no longer there, for example, on the time frame of the emergency notice. Okay, so that's the substantially damaged. Also, an interesting part is, along with that, there used to be a 10-day period before a 10-day waiting period before starting. This is one of the exemptions where there is the requirement of following. Yeah, no, I won't go into that because a lot of them have to follow B1 through 10. But in these rule packages associated with this particular exemption, the commencement started at 10 days and went to 5 days. Also, there was a requirement to notify the department within 30 days of cessation of the exemption. And that probably was because the department had to monitor this one. They had to do, or not monitor it, but do an inspection on this one. They had to know when it stopped, when it ended. So then the next exemption we'll go to is, and you'll see that, so in part of the messiness of 1038 is that there are administrative provisions mixed in with actual exemptions. And so we're going to skip E, because that's administrative now. We're going to skip F, which is administrative now. It used to be the Tahoe exemption, and that was for dead and dying on 20 acres or less. Now there are, now we often use that subsection to say, if you're in the Tahoe, this is what you'll do. So moving on to the next one, which would be G. This is the wood debris and splash removal exemption. And this was approved in 2001. And it was in response to a governor's proclamation declaring a state of emergency due to anticipated electrical shortages throughout California. Unanticipated and dramatic increases to electrical prices threatened the solvency of public utility companies. The new exemption was to allow for landowners the opportunity to provide biomass to cogen plants for the production of energy. So that's why that one came about. The next subsection is an administrative provision, and it was in response to the harvesting of large old trees. And so the board responded to comments from the regulated public and agencies to adopt new regulations concerning the harvesting of large old trees, and I have nothing else to say on that. Moving on to the forest fire prevention exemption, which is the I and the J. So it first came about in approximately 2004. We often call it the La Malfa exemption. And you can, and you've heard, the board has heard kind of the use of it. The use of it wasn't as great as it was hoped with the 18-inch constraint and the slash depth requirement. And so over time, that is now increased in the pilot project to 24 inches. And the board made the decision to increase the slash depth to 18 inches. So that is those two exemptions, the forest fire prevention exemptions. and pilot project. Now we'll go to the drought mortality exemption. And we've spoken a little bit about this. The authority was under the dead and dying part of statute, under 4584. You can see what regions it's being used in. We're on page 6 right now. It's being primarily used in region 4, which is that central Sierra region. Some in the north, a little bit on the coast, very little in region 3.
I guess I'd ask through the chair, I mean, it's very interesting history. It's here, should we continue to go through each piece of it, or?
I think we're just about through this section.
Okay, we're about halfway, but all right.
Actually, we're almost done.
Yeah, 12 pages, you're on page 6.
Oh. Oh, that's emergencies. Yeah, we're gonna, yeah, you're right.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right, we're about halfway.
Can I ask you a question? So, the LaMalfa, was it superseded by,
No,
so you can do either one?
yes,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome. So I'll speed things up a little bit. So the drought mortality exemption, because these are more fresh in our minds, the drought mortality exemption was created in response to the large-scale tree mortality. The next one, the oak woodland management exemption, which was just the board just adopted and was recently approved. And then the emergency regulation exemption for the post-fire recovery efforts within Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino counties. So then we'll go to page 8, which is the less than 3 acre conversion exemption. And this is regulated, or the statute, the authority for this is in 4584 G. And this is one of the ones that, that I read earlier, where the board shall adopt regulations that will do all of the following. And you can see it has quite a history here. And it has, there's a history, there's been abuse, it was constrained by the legislature more. There's still issues with it. Unless you have questions about it, I won't spend much more time on it. Then we get to the public agency right-of-way exemptions. One on public land, one on private land. And these are, I don't have much more to say about that, but they are used for the maintenance of right-of-ways on public and private land. Okay, moving on to page 11, and we're in emergencies now. So, with regard to the emergencies, there are about 11 more or less exemptions, depending on how you break up C and C6 and B. And there are about, depending on how you break it down, about 3 emergencies. I'll work backwards, from the most distinct ones, the emergency for sudden oak death, which is being used once. The emergency for fuel hazard reduction. And then the emergency for insect damaged timberlands is kind of lumped into the emergency for fire, drought, insects. At one point during the development of the emergency regulations, the RPF community did not have a level of comfort with, using their license to substantiate emergency based on insect outbreak alone. And so the board added that as a condition, a presumed condition for an emergency. So you have, again, you have the those emergency conditions, and then you have the sudden of death, fuel hazard reduction, and then there's also the financial emergency. The financial emergency is the only one that's constrained to use B1 through 10, and it's constrained in one other way, and I can't remember what it is, but and that's been used a few times. You can see on the last page, page 12, it has been used mostly in Region 2, and it, over the course of, since its adoption, it's been used about 48 times in Region 2, about 10 times in Region 1, and a few times in Regions 3 and 4. Now, something worth noting, and I hope we come back to this in the recommendations, the fire hazard reduction emergency and the, there was another emergency, or then there was another exemption that was used. This was used in the forest care program, which was down in the San Bernardino Mountains between like 2007 and 2013. They use those to get the work done. They use those as the CEQA documents to get the work done. Yeah, so if you, workshop 4.3 has the case study for the forest care program, and you'll see, yeah, I'd like you to turn to workshop, 4.3, perfect. And you see all those exemptions and emergencies used between 2006 and 2014. That was all because someone on the ground was making it happen on 4,800 small lots. Small lots of 10th to a quarter acre. And that, boy, again, I hope we'll talk about more as far as engaging small forest owners, what it's going to take to engage small forest owners. But those were used as the vehicle to get that work done. The fire hazard emergency and the, or the fuel hazard reduction emergency and the, I can't remember what exemption. But anyway, so let's see. As far as time goes, I am past my time. We need to go on to, yeah.
But one observation, I really do like, this is a nice history, and it also shows the use of the exemptions, and then it also gets out, remember, sorry, I think it was getting at in terms of potential duplicities here. There's some that are very similar to others, and you see the evolution, so it allows people to look at that, and by that, they dissect that. But the other part I really like about it is that you can tell by what you shaded, what are the actual exemptions with specific objectives versus what are regulatory requirements that are either standard to some or all of the exemptions. And at some point, if we think about a preamble to 1038 or separating, these are the types of exemptions, and then these are the requirements they must meet through, this is a good way to look at it, to be able to break out what's a requirement versus what is a specific exemption. So I think this is going to be pretty helpful. So,
okay, so the next item on our agenda, which is for you to turn to workshop 2.1, which breaks down statute 4589. And I can carry us through a bit, but really it's for you to, for you and the department, because it's you have to provide a report to the legislature. And the way that I so if you go to workshop 2.1, again, the bullet points at the bottom of the page break down what I see as the components to the report. They're the trends in use of exemption and emergency notices, the compliance with exemption and emergency notices, the effectiveness of exemption and emergency notices, the analysis of exemption use, whether the exemptions are having the intended effect, any barriers for small forest owners presented by the exemptions, measures that might be taken to make exemptions more accessible to small forest owners, and recommendations to improve the use of those exemptions and emergency notice provisions. And so this is where I provide a summary of the legislative analyses on the following pages. But I caution you as I provide it, but because those are the legislative analyses specific to the report, but pursuant to court cases that the legislative analyses are not the statute. It's the statute that you have to interpret and provide the report to speak to. And I'm not sure how you want to construct this part of the workshop, but what I will say is that what staff is looking for is just what, this is the beginning of the discussion of what you believe 4589 requires for the report. Reporting. What, like, relative to the material that's already been provided to you, what the department's already provided to you in previous meetings.
And it looks like you provided additional detail in that there's this workshop 5.1, which is the actual outline of the report, which I assume follows off of these bolded items.
Yes, that was created by CAL FIRE, and if you have any questions specific to the report, CAL FIRE is here to answer them. And we have two opportunities in this workshop to kind of cover what needs to be in that report. We have 15 minutes left on this agenda item before we go to public comment. So this might give a good, like, starting introduction, like, start to this conversation, but the last half hour of our meeting is also on what needs to be in that report.
Okay, so I think it is useful to look ahead to 5.1.
Yeah.
And take a look at that. It strikes me there's actually a fair amount of discretion in what this reporting out could look like. So I think in part it's going to be determined by feasibility of resources rather than the universal possible responses. Yes, so members are.
I have, oh, sorry, I need my microphone. When I read the text in 4589, I guess the things that I would focus on, in addition to what's in the proposed report format from the department, are these, well, really, whether the exemptions are having the intended effect. I think that's something we need to figure out what they mean by that. But also, there doesn't seem to be a lot about the barriers for small forest owners presented by the exemptions, or measures that might be taken to make exemptions more accessible to small forest owners. So I wonder how we get at those sorts of questions, which are really more social and economic than I see the compliance and the number of acres treated, but I do think that the effectiveness question, which doesn't really appear in, the effectiveness doesn't really appear in the, in what we're asked to put in the report. The effectiveness is up in sentence 1. I'm not thinking that,
By sentence 1, we're referring to workshop 2.1, right?
well, no, 4589, it says, yeah, the department shall review and submit a report to the legislature on the trends in the use of, compliance with, and effectiveness of. But then when it's broken down, we get the analysis of exemption use. So we'd say what exemptions are used over time, whether there are trends over the time, whether we've stopped using some of them, whether we're using some of them more, and why. Whether the exemptions are having the intended effect. And that's what I'm a little bit confused about. Whether the exemptions are having the intended effect. Is that question, do we look at that in terms of individual use of the exemptions, or are we looking at it more in terms of the overall effect? Because when you look at this, I actually get different metrics than what are in the proposed report, possibly, just personally. And I'm not sure that we need some of these necessarily. But I think what's hard to get at, well, some of this stuff I don't even see where we're being asked to do, like everything under C. In any event.
That's the accountability.
Well, it's the, C is the effectiveness of forest practice rules for the protection of public trust values. In the proposed report. Anyway, I mean, I'm just kind of responding. I'm trying to relate what we were asked to do to what the report might contain. And I think some of this is not necessary. And some things, like particularly the barriers and the accessibility to small forest owners aren't really addressed in the report format.
Well,
in any event, I mean, I think I'm just asking that we go back and forth and use the before we jump into the report format, decide more what we think we're being asked to do, and whether it really needs to be that complicated. Anyway,
yeah.
just a thought.
What page were you talking about?
Well, I'm talking
Going
about
back and forth from here to especially here.
the actual, I'm going back and forth between the actual text of what we're being asked to do and,
Workshop 5.1, page 2 of 4,
Right.
especially
what we're
under
being asked to
measures
do.
of effective. Right.
And then, the draft exemption and emergency notice monitoring report outline. And I guess the department could respond, and say whether they had actually gotten more feedback, from the legislature that made them, come up with the things that are back here in, the proposed report outline. Maybe they have.
Other questions or comments at this point? I actually think parsing out to some extent the difference, and maybe this because I'm a scientist or an economist, not a lawyer, where you talk about the effectiveness and utilization, and no matter how we do it, they'll be conflated in reporting on this. Because if you say the purpose of a regulation is to encourage management activity by someone, then the clearest evidence that the regulation was effective in creating an environment in which a landowner would engage in management is that they did so under this authority. Now, if the authority, however, were unnecessary to engage in the management activity, and you didn't have to appeal to it and the work got done anyway, you could have this weird kind of negative finding where no, people aren't using this authority because they're doing it some other way, right? And they are doing the active management, and some of this was encouraging. So if you say the purpose is to encourage people to engage in the action, but you're not analyzing the effectiveness of the action, this is, I think, where frequently we cross over into thinking about these words that are used in the authority as scientists. Sort of, okay, was the objective to get people to engage in this activity, or was the objective to change the land condition in such a way that it was more effective in accomplishing a social objective? And I think that's the spinning around in part that we got into when we were dealing with heights of slash. And we were thinking, well, is changing that height of slash requirement, is that actually accomplishing the objective we want in terms of the land condition, or is it merely something to encourage people to use the authority? And so separating all of that out, without trying to do some kind of, I think some of this stuff, if you had an unlimited budget and this was the research question of the ages, you'd go out and do a lot of landowner surveys. And you do a lot of LTO surveys, and you do RPF surveys, and you find out, was this authority used or not used, and if so, for what reason? We do have the evidence of use, and we will have commentary from stakeholder groups, which in a way is sort of a filtered and imperfect, but still a proxy for having surveyed those groups in some way to try and get a sample that allowed you to draw statistical inference, and I don't think we're doing that. The other evidence is the agency commentary on kind of compliance, right? How did this go when they do the inspection when they were done? So it's not going to be, I think, a measure of effectiveness that is necessarily not subject to interpretation because of this difficulty of what is it we're being effective at, using it or achieving a condition. So it just is, that's the problem I see in doing this, and we're going to have to go through it because we have a requirement to comment on these, and so we'll do the best we can. But other board observations on this, and it does tie, as Member Asari has said, between the actual language in 4589 on page 1 of 3, workshop 2.1, how we crosswalk from that language, which is the kind of language that comes out of the legislature, to the report we're going to have to generate here in 5.1, which is not an illogical breakdown of that, but some of it may be more easy to achieve than others. So with that, I'll shut up, and I'd love to hear how the rest of you are feeling about this.
Well, the analysis that we do may not be perfect, but it's going to get us down the road. And when you look at it, potentially contrasting the use or lack thereof of the La Malta exemption with the fire prevention pilot, and we look at the number of acres treated, and we can look at the department's inspection reports, and I think that's going to paint a fairly clear picture of the effectiveness or lack thereof of those two mechanisms. So, I think it's a worthwhile exercise. I agree with Sue that we ought to go back to the legislation and kind of rework that draft outline that's been presented to make sure that we're ticking it off and just sort of go through it methodically. I think it's going to be a worthwhile exercise.
Yeah, I think the outline is a great start. I think it's great to have that to work with. We have till when, November, I guess, to for this board to kind of wrap up its work on this.
Well, that would be a good point, just remember before we proceed that and move on to the surface. My understanding on the timeline of this is we really need to make tracks on this over the summer, that we got to get this done by early fall. Ms. Boris, any comments on, from a staff point of view on timeline relative to expectations?
What I understood from, what I heard from the department, because this is a joint report, is that for it to go through the review, we have to have a complete draft by July or August, meeting.
There we are.
And so I would recommend, it's just a recommendation to move things forward, is by the end of this meeting, we have a subcommittee of 2 to work with the department on reorienting or nailing down that report outline.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You were in the middle of your thought when I interrupted you, Mark. Would you like to finish?
Well, no, I was going to go into the weeds on too much, but I think member Husari's, we got to harmonize that. I mean, and make sure we're careful to give it our best attempt to be responsive. I think we need to be careful on the word treated, acres treated, for example, the less than 3 acre conversion exemptions, those aren't treated acres, they're just gone, so we need to be careful in our language that we use. Because there are so many of them. There's just so many. Just hearing the whole litany of them, it's kind of mind-boggling how many exemptions and emergency notice options there are.
Remember the surface you
I was going to read.
Good. Great minds think alike. Back to member, sorry.
Well, I was also going to comment on acres treated, and I do think that one thing we could do to get at what they clearly want is some kind of breakdown by small and large landowners, and we don't really have a definition of what's large and what's small, but we could display the data, I think, with, now you have to tell me if this is possible, display the data by landowner size in some kind of, so, landowners that own, less than 100 landowners, and whatever those breakdowns would be, so the legislature could see, sort of the breakdown by the size of property ownership. Because the one thing I don't see with this, Thembi, is that, is that we're really addressing that issue.
Yeah, so you know that this reporting requirement has been in the Forest Practice Committee for many months, and in one of the meetings, we had a discussion regarding small forest owners and attempted to just looked at it. And that material has been recycled in your binder, and it's, I think, in workshop 4 something. And I also added one other source of material, and that was CFIP. CFIP had a definition for small forest owner, something like that. I can't remember the exact definition, but 5,000 acres. That was the only addition to that piece. But that's in there just to provide background information. Also that came out of that particular committee meeting was, and we made progress on getting this information through a lot of collaboration with the department, California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, the data management group at CAL FIRE, but I didn't have time to put the data together before this meeting, unfortunately. But what could be accessible in short form would be harvested volume for landowners that are identified as industrial. Just because you know who the industrial owners are in the state and other. But to be able to separate 100 acres from 500 acres, from 5,000 acres, from 15,000 acres, from 25,000 acres even, I don't think we're going to be able to do that easily unless someone can correct me. And now, the information that you have in your binder on exemption size, that's a different matter. That's not ownership size. That's not what a small forest owner is. That's the size of the exemption. That's a completely different animal. Also something that I recognized in the CDTFA data, that's just something that you should know, is that one thing what's not going to be captured is because there's a minimum reporting requirement of, if you fall below a $3,000 minimum reporting requirement, you don't have to, that data is not going to be captured. So for example, let's say there's 2,000 exemptions reported each year, well, only 200, let's say, will have to report. So that's what I'm seeing in the data. 85% of the exemptions are not going to be captured in the data I'm going to be providing you soon because they fell below the minimum reporting requirement of $3,000 of value per quarter. Okay. So I just want to bring to your attention as far as time goes. So we have this agenda item as also as our last agenda item, but the two agenda items that we do want to get to are agency and public comment, which are the next on the agenda, and then the discussion of recommendations, and then we come back to this one.
And I can tell from the audience that we're going to get a lot of comment here. So let's move in that direction. Are we, I haven't seen, are we doing comment cards for this, or are we, do we have an order other than the one that's on the sheet we got here? I know we have a variety of agencies that want to comment.
Yes, and we also have two letters in your binder.
Right.
One provided by HRC and MRC, one provided by SPI. I know that the Department of Fish and Wildlife was going to speak. Beyond that, I would just encourage folks to keep their comments to 5 minutes or less.
Okay, so let's start with, is there going to be comments by CAL FIRE? And so who's going to do it? So let's start there and let's go from there to Fish and Wildlife. So let's start with the agencies. So Dennis, if you take the podium.
Good afternoon, members of the board, Chairman Gillis. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things before we go into gathering the rest of the public comments. And one of them is about effectiveness. I think effectiveness is a tough one, and I think you captured some of the concerns that we've had. But I also want to point out that part of effectiveness is that exemptions, in particular, when the board adopts exemptions, they have to determine that they're consistent with the purposes of the chapter, and the chapter includes the protection of all the other resources, so consideration of wildlife, watershed resources. So when we looking at effectiveness, we look at whether they're used, whether their intended purpose is being achieved. In other words, if it's fuel treatment, is that effective, or is there too much fuel left on the ground? And then, are they effective in meeting the other considerations of the chapter, protection of all those other resources? So that's how we're approaching it. That's why that's in there. I think the comment about addressing small landowners and the barriers to that, we're still working on that. I know you provided us some good ideas to approach that. I'd like to say if we had a lot of money, I think this would be really a good project, but I know Finby's been reaching out to landowners and has done a good job there gathering some information. And I think we'll probably at least have some pretty valuable anecdotal information about what landowners are doing and RPFs and LTOs that's really all I wanted to touch on right
Yeah,
now.
so Dennis, if I could just follow up on something you just said. So absent some sort of a determination in the record that the execution of activities authorized under an exemption had created a problem with too much slash something like this, how much should we say the absence of a finding like that on a given landowner's utilization of this authority constitutes a determination by the agency there wasn't a problem versus just an absence of information? So I guess I'm trying to think, how complete is the record in terms of the agency exercising the kind of thought process you just ran through and then documenting it?
So, in terms of,
That maybe not too vague there.
or maybe you're too deep, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I'm just, you were saying you make the determination, is this consistent with all the values?
Yeah.
Or did we see too much slash?
Right,
Something.
that's what we.
And so I'm saying, if someone used the exemption authority to do something with their land, and there's no evidence in the file that comes back and says, this didn't work, should we take that as evidence that it actually was fine in compliance, or just that the agency didn't necessarily have the time to go and check it? So I'm just saying, if this authority is exercised, is the presumption that it was consistent with the other values, or just that we may not be able to infer that, except in a very generic sense, not the specific sense?
So we're actually, have established a monitoring protocols to go look at the ones that have been implemented.
Yeah, since about when? About how long has that been in place?
The monitoring?
Yeah.
Well, we haven't actually started that. That was
Okay.
one of the problems, but yeah. So we've got the protocol set up now. We just need to get out in the field. We're going to go test that. So that'll answer some of that question, whether but it'll still be kind of subjective.
No,
At least we'll have a sample that we can look at.
Timeline for that activity?
Years.
Yeah, so it's an ongoing part of our reporting, not necessarily for the
this
initial
report.
determination of this
Yeah,
report.
exactly. So some of the effectiveness is going to be ongoing and take quite a while. The other piece of your question, though, is that if landowners chose not to do it because the slash treatment was too expensive, then was it effective in treating slash? Because there will be gaps in the landscape of protection that may have been solved by adopting some other kind of a standard that would have allowed more people to use it, maybe at a lesser treatment, but nevertheless more acres on landscape. That's a question that's very difficult to answer by doing any kind of monitoring per se. We can look at spatial distribution and say, well, all of this was treated, but there's a big gap here, or these counties do it a lot, but these counties don't.
Great, thank you.
So depending on the exemption or emergency, we need to measure different things. So I'm wondering whether in the cases where the purpose of the exemption is to create defensible space, because some of them are, although it goes beyond 100 feet, but some of it is possible to apply within that 100 feet. Is it possible to get some of the, now that is not a case where you'd be measuring slash, you'd be looking at a whole bunch of different components to get defensible space, ladder fuels. It really is way more than how deep the slash is. So is it possible to, when the department sends out inspectors to look at defensible space, to have have them look at that as opposed to incorporating that with some kind of measure of slash depth, which I don't necessarily think is going to apply that much to defensible space. Would it be possible to do it that way? Since you do have a lot of inspectors, in the field and SRA, and they could look at the latter fuels, whether the tree density is actually reduced, all the components of defensible space.
So you're thinking like an additional data element in the defensible space inspection
Right.
might be whether or not operation under these authorities had
If,
increased beyond what's simply required in the normal inspection?
well, no, if you could intersect I don't know if this is possible. Again, this may not be data that the department has access to, but since the defensible space is going to be created around habitable structures, right? But it may extend further out. Could we intersect the database for those applications with the database for defensible space inspections, and have those inspectors on those specific sites look at that component?
To get at some notion of additionality?
Yeah, mostly because I think each of these categories, you're actually looking at something different. It's, the measurement of field depth is only gonna really measure what I would call implementation, actually not effectiveness monitoring, but implementation of some of the exemptions.
Okay. So the 2 minutes
Does
you
that make
thought you'd be
sense?
up there turning
Yeah.
to 15, but member Chase, you had a question.
So building on what member Usari just asked, it sounds like we're going to rely on quite a bit of anecdotal information, at least for this report. It's a pretty tight timetable here. And would it be helpful if the department was provided, or we worked together to kind of flesh out the intention of each of these exemptions, and then reach out to your units and, for feedback on how effective, in their experience, each of these exemptions are in meeting the intended use and the intended goal of it. Is that something that would be valuable? I mean, you've got quite a few inspectors out there across the state looking at a whole cross-section of different forest types and ownership types, et cetera, and ask them to evaluate the effectiveness of it. It wouldn't be the only thing we rely on in our report, but it might be another interesting data point.
Or we might try it in one unit.
So, I'm open to any avenue. I think in terms of what Member Usari said, I think we will then look at what the defensible space inspectors are collecting and see how we can incorporate that into the work that we're doing. One thing to keep in mind is that just because of the diverse nature of all these inspections, we've already sort of decided that the fire safe exemptions are going to be a case study, because it's hard to find a random sample when there's thousands of them and the lots may be only a quarter acre to actually do true data collection in terms of sampling point. So we're going to do case studies and look at areas where this treatment's been applied and see how that has been effective or not been effective. And then I think the idea of incorporating defensible space, there's some true data there, so that may help us answer that question. We can send out a notice and say this is what we'd like you to determine in terms of effectiveness, and looking at resource protection, look at compliance. Some of that we'll get from inspection reports, but we can reach out to the units. I would also say that we probably should reach out to the other agencies that have been involved in these inspections also and see what their opinion of the effectiveness is for each of the exemptions that they've been dealing with.
Yeah, I think it's important to articulate the intended effect that these exemptions, what was the objective, and are they meeting it, and if not, why?
So I know we've got a lot of people to go to, so thank you very much, Dennis. And can I ask Fish and Wildlife if they were going to give us comments? And just to help Mark and I do the time management, everyone that wanted to make public comments, could you raise your hand so you can get a feel? So you've got at least 5 more.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gillis and members of the board. My name is Isabel Bear. I'm the new Environmental Program Manager for the Department of Fish and Wildlife's Timberland Conservation Program. It is a mouthful, but I'm the new Bill Condon in this nutshell. And that's how I've been introduced today, so we're going to roll with it. CDFW is supportive of the ongoing emergency and exemption monitoring efforts. We are prepared to assist CAL FIRE by providing information and collecting data. In regards to our experience with exemptions and emergencies, we offer the following content. The CDFW is concerned that project proponents that have filed emergencies and exemptions do not consistently follow up with CDFW under our regulatory authority, in particular as it relates to fishing game section, code section 1602, also known as lake and stream filtration. For projects conducted under emergency or exemption, CDFW receives a very low number of LSA notifications. Given that the same forest practice rule requirements for dust abatement related to THPs and NTMPs apply to exemptions in emergency operations, we have reasonable concerns that substantial diversion and/or alteration activities are occurring across the landscape at significant levels without proper notification. We recognize that the pending emergency and exemption monitoring effort is intended to determine the efficiency of forest practice rules related to these operations. They may provide valuable information related to LSA activities, and that have occurred. However, it is unlikely that these monitoring efforts will capture meaningful information related to water diversion activities. We request that the board consider impacts to water quality and overall stream system health resulting from a widespread lack of received LSA notifications related to timber operations approved under these emergencies and exemptions. Similarly, we have concerns regarding the number of exemption documents filed in comparison to the low incident of species consultation or disclosure of sensitive species, both to CAL FIRE and to CDFW. The requirement to disclose known species combined with the lack of sensitive species consultations leaves us with reasonable concerns regarding the ability of the emergency and exemption documents to represent and uphold the requirements and intentions of the forest practice rules. Determining the exact area harvested under certain scenarios can also be problematic, where entire ownerships are listed in the notice, but the areas where trees are actually harvested are not part of the public record. Lack of basic information related to harvested acres can make it difficult to determine site-specific impacts. Trends representing lack of disclosure and/or consultation over large proportions of timberlands indicate that potential significant impacts and/or taker-sensitive species could be occurring across the landscape. And finally, the large-scale use of less than 3 acre conversion exemptions with specific intent to utilize the converted land for cannabis cultivation does not seem consistent with the original intent of the exemption language. The significant amount of timberland being converted out of productive status for cannabis cultivation is alarming, and the cumulative impacts to water quality and fish and wildlife resources resulting from these conversions are not being adequately assessed. Water quality degradation due to the introduction of deleterious substances used to cultivate cannabis has significant adverse impacts to waters of the state, as well as terrestrial and aquatic listed and non-listed species. Habitat fragmentation, alteration of critical habitat availability, and resultant alterations to species behaviors are significant impacts that must be considered for listed and sensitive species throughout the state. Assessment of and mitigation of these impacts are required in the forest practice rules. However, may be overlooked in the totality of less than 3 acre conversions for cannabis cultivation. CDFW has participated in past workshops and provided information relating to this issue before. Most recently, we requested that the evaluation of these conversions for cannabis cultivation be added to the list of 2007 prioritization or forest practice rules. We strongly recommend that the board implement more stringent environmental review, including interagency rule for less than 3 acre conversions specifically intended for cannabis cultivation. And with that, CDFW staff, we're available to answer any questions.
Thank you.
I guess just a comment on the dust abatement, particularly on the less than or the 10% exemptions, salvage exemptions. Those are typically very low production jobs that oftentimes don't necessitate dust abatement associated with log haul, just because the production level, the number of loads is doesn't necessitate it. Also on oftentimes on industrial lands anyway, the salvage harvest will kind of be in conjunction with the THP operation, and so the dust abatement is also is often addressed by the THP or in the THP.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, a couple of questions.
Sure.
So is the cannabis primarily just because the sheer number of them, or other types of clearing just for whatever it is, or other agricultural uses, or is it the?
Cannabis is definitely the hotter topic right now, and definitely I think what we're seeing the most of.
I mean, compared
Carolyn
to.
Peterson, CDFW. I would say the number of as well as also illegal, which is a whole other ballgame. But the main concern is the amount of productive timberland that's being taken out of production and the cumulative impacts related to that.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah.
And I'm concerned about that too, but so if it's an illegal
Can we
conversion.
follow up on that? So it's the amount of timberland taken out, not the cultural practices on the total acres that are taken out?
No, I think that the main concern are the cumulative impacts associated with the intended land use post-conversion.
Agricultural and, potential rodenticides and that type of thing?
Yes, and from our field observations,
Use.
yes, that would be based off of our field observations. So, and that would include erosion treatment or lack thereof, rodenticides, various chemicals that are used on the properties, things that we typically don't see during other land use types that timberland is converted for.
But in terms of illegal conversions, that's not even in the scope of what we're working on. It's a problem. It's a big.
Right, it is a problem, but no, this is specifically, I think we're referring specifically to legal and reported, notified conversions.
And on the lack of 1600 agreements or is it more follow through with them when they're required? Because many of the exemption vehicles here don't allow for, water, WILPES, activities, for example. Can you parse out where those are the biggest problems?
I think our biggest concern is likely with diversion or substantial diversion of water. The fact that we recognize that a lot of these exemptions are on small landowners. And so there are a lot of different types of operations, but the fact that we, in the last 3 to 4 years, from Butte County down to Calaveras, I think we wrote one LSA agreement for fire salvage. And it really wasn't, it was for an emergency salvage plan.
Under emergency notice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think Member Sortos.
I'm formulating the question still. I was looking for another good one from
So
Andre, but let me just ask. I'm super interested in the 1600 permit as well, and I'm curious if there is any evidence that you could link which exemptions or permits are the problems with the 1600s?
We don't have any evidence because there's been no monitoring done to this point. We have.
So it's the lack of applications.
It's the lack of applications.
That's the data point we're looking at.
It's the lack of applications, yes. There isn't any real data, unfortunately, and we would love to get out there and start engaging in some of these monitoring efforts with CAL FIRE so that we can get a better handle on what that data actually looks like. But it does cause us, we do pause and have a little concern, just considering the amount of applications or notifications that we've received for any kind of timber operations under THP or NTMP or other kind of timber harvesting document, and that we have, little to absolutely no notifications for any of these others.
Yeah.
It's when you walk around out there on the ground in the landscape, it's hard to believe that there's no substantial diversion or any alteration going on, so.
On the lack of consultations on some of them, do you have data about where there's been conversions or emergency notices or exemptions, where there's been take or impacts to nest tree or sensitive habitat or rookery or something like that?
No concrete data, again, because the monitoring effort has not commenced, and CAL FIRE's initial monitoring effort is going to be limited because of the time constraints that there will be to get this report completed. But I think that we have discussed the potential for incorporating additional survey measures into the protocols so that we can get a more long-term effectiveness monitoring idea of what's going on with that. I do know of, exemptions that have been filed on, we've seen some things on the ground. We don't have any concrete data. And there may be some people on the North Coast that work in the NSO area that might have a different opinion on that. But no numbers to give you. And I wish that I did, and we hope to get to that point very soon.
Okay.
So.
Okay, thanks. Mandy, do you want to add to DFW?
Sure, call me out by name. Mandy Culpepper, Department of Fish and Wildlife. Hi, for Isabel. So we didn't want to get this too down the weeds on the NSO line of thought, but I guess I'll bring it up since it already came up. We do have concerns that emergency notices and exemptions are happening potentially without contacting CDFW, and in some areas, companies or landowners or RPFs are getting in touch with us about activity centers that are on the ground, but in other cases, it seems like they're just assuming there are no northern spotted owl because there was a fire or because all the trees are dead, so there must not be any owls, and we're concerned about that kind of activity going on. Again, I don't have specific numbers in front of me, and this is one of those big questions that's in the air, like what is actually being impacted on the ground, and we really need to get people looking at what's going on. Again, one of the things that Isabel brought up was that we don't often know what's actually being harvested, so it might be a notice that has thousands of acres listed, but their only treatment is, a couple of 100 acres, and it's hard to know if there are impacts going on when you don't know where the harvest is going on. So I think there's just a lot of questions that are out there, and I do hope that CAL FIRE and us can go out there and get some information and give it back to you guys. It'd be great for us to have the information to look at as well, but I don't have any further data points to bring up, just more questions.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm looking at, I can see the clock, and I was gonna, since we were on water earlier, ask Dave, water boards. Your name's on the cheat sheet, just so you know.
Dave Fowler, North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board. I really don't have anything additional to add that Fish and Wildlife hasn't said. Obviously, we agree with Fish and Wildlife's concerns about water quality issues. We have not, similar to Fish and Wildlife, we have not done any independent audits of exemptions or emergencies. We are planning on participating with CAL FIRE when they start their inspections later this year. In fact, I think it's just the week after next, we'll be doing the initial out at logs with them. So I think that's about all I have.
Thank you, Dave. Can I see those hands again? Okay. Before we get to the folks who just raised their hands, Elliot and Erica, do you just gonna see if you had anything that you wanted to add for your departments? Okay. Rob, you're in the front row. I know you want the last word.
Yeah, thank you, Vice Chairman Andre, board members, Rob Turner, Environmental Protection Information Center. It's astounding to me, given that we're all adults, that no one wants to sit in the front row. Folks that may or may not notice that when I come here, I absolutely do that on purpose. Anyway, I digress. Lots of really interesting talk here today, and I'm very appreciative that you all have taken on this task. Obviously, the legislature gave you a mandate. But first of all, speaking to some of the questions and the comments made by the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Water Board, they didn't say a lot, but he said a lot, I think, to you all, and things that we've been trying to tell you now, at least for the last year, at least in the context of your emergency timber operations in 1052, which is, are you sure you're ensuring that those operations as they are conducted on the ground are complying with all other applicable laws, which certainly they are required to do, all of your permitting frameworks are. And I would suggest to you that there's definitely an open question and debate to be had about that, given just the little bits of the anecdotal things you've heard here, let alone if we actually tried to gather evidence, which I think is a good idea. And I also want to suggest to you all that regardless of, you have a timeline that's real short, real tight to get a report, maybe a way that I might suggest to you is, get the facts and figures in the report done, but don't call it good there. Don't feel like you're done with this topic. Let's keep talking about this. Let's keep investigating this. Let's keep really digging into this. I think that it doesn't have to be one or the other. And I would really encourage you to not have it be just, it's done, it's over, we're done with it. Kick the can some more on some of these other really important issues like protection of other resources like water quality, endangered species, timberland conversion, timberland productivity. I don't want to lose track of that one. You all know how much I love that one. All of these emergency and exempt frameworks, how are they affecting timberland productivity, whether under, large industrial SYPs, option A's, PTPIRs, under MSPC, just for, or NCMPs for that matter, or to the extent that working forest management plans happen on the ground. Those two frameworks are very clear that not only is the goal uneven age management, but long-term sustained yield. How do these frameworks, if they are applied on those landscapes, affect those calculations and those objectives? Just thoughts more for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Dr. Henley, Russ, I think I remember your hand up.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Russ Henley, California Natural Resources Agency. I just wanted to make a couple of comments from the perspective of the AB 1492 program. And since the legislative direction came out to do this study, it's been a regular topic of discussion at our monthly leadership team meetings. And some of the things that I've emphasized in that is the direction in the legislation of this being an interagency effort. And I just want to emphasize that the water boards and Fish and Wildlife have really stepped up their engagement in this. And even though they're not called out in the legislation, the California Geological Survey has stepped up as a participant in this as well. So I think that's a really good sign that we're doing that. And I also want to note the legislation also points to public participation. And certainly the board's engagement on this topic has been a critical piece of the public forum for this topic. So I'm really glad that the board is having this workshop today to provide a significant opportunity for public comment on this item. I want to reiterate what has come up earlier, that the report that's due at the end of the year is really just wave one of a long-term project. Time is short. There's some questions about what the scope should be, and CAL FIRE and the other agencies are going to do their best to deliver something within that time period. And I think CAL FIRE deserves credit for when this direction came through from the legislature, is that they stepped up with a budget change proposal to sort of move forward with long-term capacity to address monitoring of exemptions and emergencies in the form of 5 new staff to do that work. So that long-term resource is going to be there to help ensure that this monitoring and evaluation gets done. And I think that's a valuable thing. In the question of that, there was some discussion raised by Busari, but what is the scope of effectiveness? And I thought that Dennis Hall framed up nicely, pointing to the broader purposes of the Forest Practice Act and Forest Practice Rules to protect a broad range of resources. And I think also if you look at the legislative analysis that was provided as a part of the workshop exhibit 2.1, and that really talks about, from the ledge staff side, tensions between ministerial and discretionary permits and concerns that they're seeing a lot of activity occurring under just ministerial permits that didn't have the same level of review and evaluation, particularly multi-agency review and evaluation that you get under discretionary permits. So I think that also points to concern on the legislative side, not just what are kind of the functional purposes of these emergency exemptions, fuel reduction, for example, but also the broader question of what resources are of concern with these. So thank you very much.
Russ, do you think there's a programmatic approach potential for some of these exemptions? I mean, rather than just a ministerial.
I think there's always that, certainly, and that's challenging. You know, look at the struggle to get to the end of the road with the vegetation treatment program, EIR, for example. So there's a challenge. There have been some PT-EIRs put in place, the Weaverville one, for example, to address fuel reduction and things like that. I think that's been used a little bit. The one that was done for Meadow Vista, I don't believe has been used at all. So the record, at least from some of those more focused programmatic pieces, is not necessarily the best. I think we still need to keep working on this. You know, we're hopefully the Forest Carbon Plan is going to get released by the governor's office soon, and there's a number of different discussions of goals in there, but one of the more aspirational goals is sort of a vision that we probably want to be treating around 500,000 acres per year of non-federal lands to address forest health and resiliency issues. Now, that's a very broad range of treatments that are considered under that, but you know, what are the mechanisms we need to enable landowners to move their forests to healthy and resilient conditions that are going to be more adaptable to the kind of climatic changes that we're coming to? And certainly there are some opportunities provided with the current suite of exemptions and emergencies, but there also seem to be a lot of feelings out there that we need more than that.
I'm glad you brought up the Forest Carbon Plan, because I was going to ask you about that. Whether in this report, I imagine the legislative side is going to ask the consistency with that plan in terms of something like all these exemptions and notices for how they're at least, you know, not running counter to the goals of that plan.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, you look at the other pieces that we've seen lately, the LEO report that came out last week, the Little Hoover Commission report from February, I believe, the Public Policy Information Center report from last fall, and they all, you know, have a very consistent message about what we need for our forest plans.
Okay, thanks. Big questions for us?
One question. And I don't know if this is the right question, but when you said something around having 5 dedicated staff from CAL FIRE to participate in this monitoring effort, it harkens me of different environmental regulatory programs where they have inspections as part of the permitting process, or even maybe random sub-selection of the permitting process. Is that an appropriate capacity thing that we could inject in some of these emergency notices that people are on notice that they could be inspected?
I think CAL FIRE could better answer that question.
Agreed. Yeah, thanks.
That's all CAL FIRE. The question, should we be putting something in regulatory language that advises the people that there can be inspections?
Sounds like we've got a big data gap, and at least putting people on notice that they're going to be held responsible for maintaining the resources appropriately is often an effective tool.
Yeah, I think, we have a pretty robust inspection program to determine compliance, and then the board's rules that have been adopted are supposed to ensure the protection of resources. We've just never made the connection yet, and so we're just treating these as inspections. Pretty much the monitoring, we're going to be doing them on active or current exemptions and emergencies, so that we have access to the property, and people that get those pretty much, I think, know that we can come out at any time and do an inspection. We got that discretion, so it's not a bad idea to get the word out. And I think as we embark on our monitoring efforts, we will send out some notices and post on our website that the process is ongoing and that we may be out visiting. That's a good idea.
Just one brief comment on following up on a couple of things Russ said about increasing the pace and scale of treatments, and then also the looking at discretionary versus ministerial permits. One thing, if there's a way we can kind of tease it out and evaluate it in the report, is are these acres being treated under a ministerial permit as opposed to a discretionary, and did they in fact have an option, or is the only choice really ministerial or nothing? In other words, are those new acres that are getting treated because there is a lower cost option that enables that marginal job, those marginal acres to get treated, or are they trading out a discretionary permit for a less burdensome ministerial permit? So to the extent we can drill down and try to assess how many additional acres are being treated because of some of these new tools, I think that's critical.
It's an interesting point, yeah, because that counts the truly added value of the exemptions. Yeah.
I mean, just we've treated a lot of acres under that fire prevention pilot that we would not have done had that not been available to us.
Okay. Yeah. There are at least three more. Yeah. Why don't y'all just line up there, and then I want to recall who it was. Is that right? And we've had mostly agency. Hopefully, we'll have some landowner RPF folks provide some feedback to the board.
Good afternoon, Vice Chairman, members of the board. My name is Cedric Dwight. I work for Sierra Pacific Industries. My comments, you'll see my comment letter, and please refer to that. It's sort of a storybook that sort of frames our comments on emergency notices and exemptions. In short, I just want to take this opportunity to remind you all that catastrophic wildfire harms landowners. There's no benefit to getting burned over by catastrophic wildfire. Sometimes, for some reason, it strikes me when I'm listening that we lose that in a conversation about that. The impacts are immediate, and there's no way to recover from all the losses caused by that kind of a natural disaster. The economic losses are significant and they're immediate, and it's just a question of whether or not you're going to be able to recover. How much of that is losses you're going to be able to recover? You'll never be whole after catastrophic wildfire. These losses are also significant to public trust resources, and they're immediate to watershed values, wildlife, and carbon stocks. Fortunately, with a willing landowner, the solution that maximizes the landowner's economic recovery is also the same process that can help recover the ecosystem values. Public trust resources are all concerned about watershed runoff, wildlife, and carbon stocks. The emergency notice process facilitates these actions. All these recovery and restoration activities are backstopped, of course, with the forest practice rules, the water quality control, waste discharge requirements, the California and Federal Endangered Species Acts, all planned and administered by registered professional foresters. So there's a licensed professional overseeing those activities. Also, let's not forget that responsible agencies can visit these areas on a daily basis if they like to review the compliance with forest practice rules, Border Colonial Endangered Species Act provisions. We know from recent post-fire erosion research by Dr. James, she leads ours at the Sierra Pacific Research Department, that reducing post-fire watershed erosion is maximized when you operate harvest operations within the prior to the first 2 winters. Fire salvage followed by rapid reforestation, which is a standard practice for industrial landowners, helps also mitigate the watershed or restore the watershed values that are important to all of us. Rapid reforestation also helps return the carbon stocks to the landscape and improves wildlife structure availability in the near and long term. All that said, Sierra Pacific Industries believes the emergency notice process is a very effective and efficient mechanism for recovering both the economic and public trust resources following catastrophic wildfire. Thank you. Available for questions.
Questions for Senator? Okay, thank you. And John, you have a letter in here too, so we have that in our.
Yeah, I won't repeat that.
That's okay.
John Anderson, Humboldt, Mendocino Redwood Companies. Yeah, I wasn't going to come up because of the letter, but when I heard some of the comments about 1,600 permits, I felt a little inclined to come up. We usually apply for those when we are doing some kind of road work, upgrading a stream crossing, but under the exemptions, it clearly states in the beginning of the language that you can do no road construction or reconstruction. You cannot be in a WILPIS. So I would venture to guess that if this was looked at a little more closely, you'd find that the reason there's less 1,600 notifications is due to the fact that there's very tight restrictions under the existing language and exemptions. And similarly with the water drafting, I'll only speak for our company, but you have to submit a 1,600 permit when you draft and have any significant alteration of bed, bank, or channel. And if we just drop a hose in a creek, we just assume that's significant. That's such a subjective term, so if we're going to draft, we're going to get a permit. And the restrictions have gotten very, very tight in this regard, to a point that we've gone to disconnected ponds that are not connected to water courses, wells, anything to be able to avoid having to go through weekly inspections and flow calculations. And we have to send people out to these every single week now as they get lower and lower flows in the summer. So it's very laborious. But again, I'll just speak for our company and say that if we're touching the creeks as far as drafting, certainly we will be applying. And I think that I'm not alone in that regard. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Danielle Lindler. I'm a registered professional forester and a pest control advisor with Jefferson Resource Company. We have offices in Placerville, Fort Bragg, Wairika, and Anderson, so we cover a lot of the state. And our company works with small landowners, and we do a ton of emergencies and exemptions for small landowners. A couple of the points I want to make. First, on emergencies, I saw in one of the recommendations that it should be considered that a landowner needs to submit an emergency within 1 year. I would highly disagree with that timeline. On a small landowner, especially those that might own 10 acres, 20 acres, 100 acres, after the fire and they're trying to figure out what to do, their house burned, 1 year seems like a long time, but when you are kind of in shock 1 year goes by very fast, as well as emergencies are only good for 1 year. So sometimes by the time we're able to line up a logger, which there's a shortage of, especially on small landowners, it could take us a year to even find a logger to do the work. So in that recommendation, I would really argue against a 1 year restriction. CFIP allows for 5 years, and I would try to keep it in line with CFIP funding, which does allow 5 year for the 90% reimbursement. But the reason our clients choose exemptions is not to circumvent any forced practice rule, which you're allowed to do or required to do. It's a cost. Without the ability to have some type of permitting vehicle that reduces the cost to our landowners, those lands simply would not be treated. And even with the small landowners that we work with, 5, 10, 20 acres, it is often the case when we have to bundle those landowners to a 20 to 40 acre minimum just to have some kind of economy of scale, just to be able to even attract a logger. It's very hard to find loggers that want to work on small landowners because there's just not enough loggers, or the liability to work on the small properties are so great. We have projects in Siskiyou County that I personally am working on. I've been waiting 1.5 years to find a logger. They're in high density subdivisions. There's not people there to do the work. So it's not trying to circumvent, it's just one more tool from a financial standpoint that allows them to get the work done. There's been question about, why aren't the 1600 permits? I would echo the comments that we're not allowed to work in creek zones. So we don't do 1600 permits under the exemptions because we're not near water, we're not drafting. Very limited benign projects often. As foresters, we know that, well, let me just back up. There's a perception, I should say, that an emergency or an exemption is a bypass to following forest practice rules and protecting teeny species and water quality. Well, my license prevents me from taking the listed species as well as delivering sediment deleterious to water bodies. So my license could be in jeopardy. I would question, though, on those projects that, if the agencies are seeing an effect, I would question, are those effects being seen on projects that don't require an RPF versus those that are? Where are you seeing the problems? Because I know within our company, we still consult our biologists, we still do botanical surveys, we still review CNGDB prior to the exemptions. And I know a lot of my colleagues with other companies do the same. One thing I would say that is needed within the exemption process is some sort of road construction exemption, not only for a typical thinning exemption, but also we have several clients that are required to bring their roads up to standards, 4290 standards, 4291. They're not allowed to do that currently without using a less than 3 acre conversion. Well, if they've already used their 3 acre conversion to build their house, then that option is no longer there. We have a situation where a landowner at the end of the road wants to build a house. Part of the requirement is the road into his home, going through his adjacent landowners, be brought up to code. All the adjacent landowners were compliant, saying, great, that sounds good, it'll benefit us, up until the point they found out they needed to use their 3 acre conversion. Some of them had already used their conversion to build their house or had other plans, so they changed their mind. The reality is the landowner's not building the home, but furthermore, the road is not being brought up to code, so the ingress egress for fire safety is not happening. So I would, not that we need more exemptions, but a road right-of-way exemption would be a great option for us. Other barriers that we see is because we have several offices throughout the state, there is some interpretation of which exemption can be used where within the agency. And I would just urge the agencies to have some kind of consistency from, say, the North District to the Cascade District to the Southern District. So with that, thank you for your time and holding this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Any board member want to chime in on any kind of questions for anybody? Please do.
Good morning, members of the board. My name is Larry Camp. I'm here as a small landowner in RPF and also representing forest landowners. I don't want to belabor the point, and we had an extended discussion in the Forest Practice Committee this afternoon about the current kerfuffle about NTOs for NTMP holders and the use of exemptions and possibly emergencies. And we would heartily ask that you either direct CAL FIRE with policy or change your current regulations to allow those two things to be done. Most landowners using NTMPs are growing more than they're harvesting, and if there are issues with growth and yield, the department already has the authority to kick people out of the NTMP program. My observations or discussions with CAL FIRE members has indicated that that option has been exercised hardly at all in the 25 plus years that the NTMP program has been used. And, when you're spending $25,000 to $50,000 to do an NTMP, to use light touch forestry, and then you're in effect penalized under the current interpretations, it's just not good long-term management. You wonder how many people were involved with this. Well, I did a study that counted up the NTMPs, not counting Humboldt, Mendocino, Sonoma, and Santa Cruz. There are over 100,000 acres and about 250 landowners. Those numbers would probably double if you added in those areas that I didn't have time to add in. So if you've got any questions, I'd be glad to try and answer them. So thank you.
Well, I can't resist. I have one.
I'm sorry?
I have one. So on the topic of NTMPs and exemptions, for an NTO, if you didn't have the NSO aspect, what's the issue with just doing an NTO? You have all the information on your property, where botanical resources are, estuaries and things like that. Erosion control plan, perhaps that's one thing. But why not the NTO? What is so onerous? Convince me of why.
Well, you've got the NSO issue. There are other species issues. Great gray owl is another 2-year survey species. Currently, CAL FIRE has been cooperative with looking at emergencies that are exempt notices with respect to fire, etc. Using, treating those as minor deviations. But if you read this rule language literally, they could require that to be treated as a major amendment, which would require 30 days. So I'm just saying that, there are some potential issues out there.
Okay. Yeah, this is an important one for us to understand what flexibility is within the notice of timber operation, so that it's not as severe, constraint as what we're hearing. Potentially, maybe there's a solution.
If the issue is somebody who's filing an exemption and taking, a significant volume off every year in violation of their growth and yield studies, then our organization, and I think most RPS that I know of, and landowners would say, kick them out of the program. But if it's picking up 1 or 2 loads of logs to pick up insect salvage trees, why shouldn't we be able to use the NTO or the emergency, either the emergency or the exempt notice?
Or an NTO that's a different flavor.
Well, NTOs can get very complicated. I know of one who was submitted in Santa Cruz recently. It ran 60 pages. Now, when this started out, it was typically a 3 or 4 page document. So, NTOs have gotten more complicated along with everything else.
Yeah, I'm talking about the 3 truckload bug trees. Anyway, more on that later. Sorry, any other questions for?
Yeah, I think you touched on a good thing. I think it'd be worthwhile for small landowners in CLFA to move through 1090.7, the requirements of the NTO contents, and what is it specifically that results in a 60-page notice of timber operations. There's definitely thought the NTO is supposed to be a fairly simple filing device, recognizing, well, my NTMP was not prepared to do a fuel hazard reduction or to do one of these exemptions that we're looking at. So there's a cost of having an amendment to the NTMP to allow for that, which a lot of people say, well, I have to do a $5,000 amendment, I already paid $90,000 for my NTMP. So that's a cost. But then just to go into the NTO, why is the NTO not as streamlined as initially imagined? I think it'd be a worthwhile exercise.
We will try and develop some more information and get that back to the board.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ricky Schertz. I work for Jefferson Resource Company, and I'm a member of the CLFA board. Just to piggyback real quick on what Mr. Camp was saying, under the NTMP 1090.7P, I believe it is, it was regarding the RPF must submit a statement stating that the factual and the activities under the NTO are congruent with the NTMP, and the activities being conducted are going to be relevant or to the plan. And so that's one issue there. If half the stand is dead from beetles or fire, you can't really make that statement. And if you can't file an exemption, which are currently being returned, like a 1038K or something, then they don't have much options but to upgrade to NTMP. So the other thing I wanted to mention was, it seems looking at these recommendations that there's 2 big issues, largely getting small landowners engaged and how do we condense or reduce the amount of exemptions out there. First thing I want to point out is these exemptions all came into existence, or emergencies, for a reason, specific purpose for that exemption. And I think that's very important. We need those tools because it's not always black and white. And I mean, some cases are very black and white, but it's a gray area. We need to be able to use as many tools as you can to help a landowner manage their property. The NTMP is a perfect example. If they can't use an exemption, then now their only option is to either withdraw that NTMP or to completely update it to be accurate with what the conditions of the stand are. Another example is clients. I mean, we talked about small landowners wanting them to go towards a discretional permit. Well, if you look over the past few years, there just isn't that many of them out there. The reason being, they're a complicated, expensive process. And landowners who are under 20 acres, really, economically, it's very hard for them to afford this process and get a full-blown timber harvesting plan or even a modified timber harvesting plan. And then in some cases, they get it, and now they're being told recently that they can't file an exemption on top of that. And where in the past, for 10 years in the past, they had managed strictly under exemptions, just removing hazard trees from the property. Now they decide to be good forest managers and file the THP, and now they can't file an exemption on it. So they're stuck in a situation where they really regret filing the THP. So it's kind of a conundrum there. And then the other thing, I just want to make sure it's understand that we are RPFs, and I know it may seem like these exemptions are being filed and there's may not be adequate care for wildlife, water resources stuff, but a good RPF is going to do his due diligence, and they're going to do a survey of the area. They're going to scope for species. They're going to make sure this stuff is addressed. They're not just going out, flip it, throw in this exemption, and say, have at it, LTO. And that's one thing I want to make sure that's understood. So I think the accountability needs to be held to the RPF on those situations. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Any questions for Ricky? Sure it was.
Yeah.
Any more public comment? Well, it's great when you have a workshop and people, come and provide comment. That's the essence of it. So thanks to everybody for providing that information. That's certainly appreciated. I hope we captured that all, and we'll be discussing that. We're a little bit past 3 o'clock, and we were going to shift to discussion of potential recommendations. I think, then you're going to
Yes.
lead us into that.
Yes, well, one of the things, so I would like you to please turn to workshop 4.1. Now, staff gathered these recommendations over the last 6 months from a variety of sources and created broad categories in which to organize them. Most of these recommendations are not for the legislature, but have been included for context. What staff is hoping is for guidance as to which ones to develop for either future rulemaking or for the legislature, and most immediately for the legislature. Where do you want to see staff go? Couple of things that I want to bring to your attention just from my research, that I don't know if we make the best decisions when we react as opposed to proact or act. And in more than half, if not 3/4, if not all, we're not asking the question how, what is it that good forest management looks like and how do we incentivize that on the landscape? We're reacting to something, whether it's fire, insects, abuse. That's just something to consider for the future. I suggest here, and I think it's going to take integration, in terms of, if you are going to act in a proactive fashion, you're going to have partners, and I think and this is my opinion, but and this dovetails into engaging small forest owners. And this is evidenced in the forest care case study, is you have to have technical assistance, you have to have collaboration with local and regional entities, you have to have cost sharing, because these are landowners who they don't own the land to manage it. That's not, or manage it for timber harvest. That's not the reason why they own it. They may be interested in doing that for forest health reasons. But as you get smaller and smaller parcels, they are not interested in, that is not their primary objective. And that has been borne out in research by the National Woodland Owner Survey. Primarily they own it for recreation, beauty, aesthetics. You can see that that information under B. On page 1 of 7 in the recommendations. I think it's worth talking about. Excellent article, an evidence-based review of timber harvesting behavior among private woodland owners provides behavioral insight into how small forest owners behave. The most reliable predictors of timber harvesting, to get, and the interest seems to be to have landscapes be managed in aggregate. Well, if you have, like in the forest care study, these folks in the San Bernardino Mountains own 10th acre to quarter acre lots. I've been in plenty of subdivisions in Mendocino County where a 1,400 acre ranch has been subdivided into 10th acre lots. There's now, thousands of lots that are forested, that we're now wanting to manage in aggregate. As soon as you start getting to that size, you're going to have to do something more than just a streamlined timber harvesting permitting option. It takes, again, collaboration, technical assistance, and grant funding. But the most reliable predictors of timber harvesting was whether or not they were going to receive good harvest prices, if they had a management plan, if they were well educated, they own good timber stock, and they participated in some sort of extension programming. And then also that the most frequently tested characteristic was parcel size, not surprising considering the economies of scale, just as Danielle was pointing to, associated with larger properties. And I wanted to shout out to, like Danielle, and there's an effort happening, which I've highlighted in there, I think it's called My Sierra Woods, where you're trying to provide these trying to build these collaborations between loggers, foresters, to get the economies of scale, technical assistance, to get the economy scales in place to provide these services to these small forest owners. I think in far as engaging in small forest owners, so I've talked about the act instead of react. As far as small forest owners go, I think the biggest bang for your buck is going to be not in creating more streamlined timber harvesting permitting options for these landowners. It's developing those other things. And I think you can probably look to the Tree Mortality Task Force, because I know that they've done work in that area. Also, this forest care program, was very effective, but it had those components. So I just want to give you an orientation before I turn it over to you for, discussing how you want the staff to develop. Do I have anything more? Everything else has pretty much been, I think everything else is pretty self-explanatory. If you have any questions, I'm here. But I, as staff, helping in this effort, would very much like to hear your take on where you want to see this go, what you want to see developed.
Okay, well, I think we have about an hour for the board to mull over the recommendations that are here before us and expand on them or comment on them or try to refine that down. So yeah, time is shorter than I thought, so we'll have to wrap this up by July in Bishop, California, I think is where we'll be for that last touch of this. So, do we think there are any duplicate exemptions, or do we think there's a need to expand them to include additional recommendations? Or do we think it's all covered and maybe, remember, I'm sorry.
Well, I don't have a recommendation, but it would be really helpful to know, Sandy and Albert, are there some of these exemptions or emergencies that, I heard you say that the sod one had been used one time, right? The sudden of death. And then, are there some that used to be used and they're not used anymore? It's good to know how many times they've been used, but it'd be better to know the trends over time.
Which ones are?
And maybe some of them, there's a correlation with an insect outbreak or a correlation with a drought. So, but I do think that would be valuable. That's also valuable in terms of answering the questions from the legislature. If we can show that if we can just show how they, over time, how they were used. And I know also you try to show how they've varied. I know it got cold here again. What is wrong with the, anyway, the HVAC system in this building, but I always bring 3 sweaters but whether we could show if there's a correlation with either an area of the state that's having a drought or an insect outbreak, that kind of thing, or wildfire seasons. I think it's clear from the legislative discussion that there's a concern that they're being used too much, and also from our partner agencies, but is that because there's been more of a need? Could we know that, and could we provide that information to the legislature as part of our monitoring, as they make their considerations, because they work, in real time, usually.
Yeah, So is it a new trend line or just episodic fluctuation kind of thing?
I think the 1038K has absolutely been used in response to the tree mortality. I think, for example, the streamlined timber harvesting permitting tools that were used in the forest care program, they just, they picked what would fit because they had to have CEQA, coverage. And so whatever worked, they picked it and they moved forward. All the other ones, like the structure protection ones, those, they're, I guess, everything else is kind of at the impetus, or at the, at the propulsion of the landowner, and so, I don't know what else to say.
Well, I guess I meant, are there some of them that we thought would be a good idea that nobody ended up using, that kind of thing?
I mean, sod is, there has only been one used, but, I mean, where that, whoever, brought that about, I don't know whether it's worth taking it off the books. I don't know. I mean, because for the case of the person that needs it, I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
You get, just to jump in, those are interesting questions. If there's a solid need, but nobody's using it, why? And so,
yeah. Is it the exemption?
Yeah.
Is it that the constraint, or
is it an owner's exemption? Does it miss the boat on something, or is there no longer a biological need or ecological need for it? So those are questions we probably need to dive into. I would just respond to the 4589. Certainly my understanding, working with the legislature on a few projects, such as the Woodlands, was there was a concern in part of the legislature of overuse of exemptions. But the language that came out in 4589, what appears in statute, is the report shall also include recommendations to improve the use of those exemptions and emergency notice provisions. So it's, I think in the general reading, when you read there's 15 different exemptions, you're wondering, well, that's a lot of different exemptions. And then you get into the detail and you find out 3 of them are the evolution of the same exemption over 15 years. That we need to look at ways to consolidate for targeted reasons and then apply that sort of recommendation to the legislature. Agreed.
Yeah.
Just a comment on that. When we've been asked to go in front of the legislature, what I notice is that different regions, legislators are getting hit with different kinds of questions. So some regions, their constituents are saying there's too many, and other ones are hearing from their individual landowners saying we need more exemptions. So you get this really uneven feedback regionally in the state, and we get this sort of weird paragraph that sort of summarizes we need more. There's too many of them. So we're sort of in this caught trying to figure out how to negotiate that.
And I think that's going to be the challenge of teasing them out. I mean, just take the examples of 1038B. And people are concerned as you file a 100 or whatever 20,000 acre exemption. And what does that mean? And where are they actually operating? Is it too many? May have to address that specifically versus why doesn't the SOD exemption? Why doesn't one person use it? So, and the clock's ticking, of course.
Also, she brought up small landowners, and in here it talks about, accessibility for small landowners, and that's why I'm sure Libby spent that time on that and how to get people more involved. And you don't see, in the Redwood Complex fire in Mendocino County, people that had timberland never thought of it as timberland. It is those subdivided acres, and they might own 160 acres, they might own 40 acres, but to them it was their backyard, and it wasn't timberland until it burned. And now they're looking at a problem and how to solve that, because there's nothing left but burnt trees, and brush and other things. So now they're trying to figure that out. But somehow they never thought of themselves as timber, as landowners with timber that they should be managing. And I don't, when you bring up your discussion on that, I don't know, you reach them now because they need you. And then you'll keep them and they'll keep, on it because now they're going to be planting trees and they're interested. But prior to that, when you talk, the people I've spoke to, they've been like, well, we just never thought of it that way. We never thought that we owned timberland. I don't know how we solve that in this paragraph.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics there. I mean, you definitely see the smaller the parcel sizes get, the less incentives there are, the less economical it is, and then the owners of that land don't see themselves as timber managers, so.
So, building on that, the greater the burden of regulatory compliance, the higher that hurdle rate is. And so I guess I'm a little concerned with page 3 of 7, section D, constrain ministerial and streamline discretionary timber harvest permitting options. That may make good sense in certain areas and certainly something worth considering, but I don't know if we have to jump in with that objective because, as we increase that cost of regulatory burden, it's going to have to be offset by something else, some other program in order to maintain or increase the management on those smaller parcels. And, the size of the parcel where the hurdle can't be overcome depends on a lot of different factors, and, site quality, proximity to the closest sawmill or outlet for those products, the species mix and condition of the timber on the property. I mean, it varies dramatically across the state, so we're not going to settle on some single acreage threshold, but, that's where I hope we get, a lot of good comment from the regulated public on that to help us, determine where those ministerial permits are enabling more acres to get treated in a cost-effective way. So that we make sure that we maintain those tools and those options for landowners to use.
Good point. Yeah, Eric.
Mr. Chairman, Eric Cal Fire, I just want to go back to Member Husari's question and specifically draw your attention to the first page of our proposed report outline where we speak to trends in use. And I want to make sure under trends in use that we're capturing what it is you'd like us to capture. As I see it, we were trying to answer those questions you were asking. Which exemptions are being used? How are they being used to the extent we can deduce by what size landowners they're being used? Or is that getting at what you want us to get at?
Yeah, and I guess I was just looking for some kind of trend over time. But also, like you said, who's using them? I do think, an important component, which I'm not sure we can get at, is that kind of speaks to what you were talking about, is whether the landowner lives there. Most people that live on a piece of timberland actually, Carol, they may not really be thinking about whether, timber management, but they are really concerned about how aesthetics, and they are super concerned when they either have a problem with mortality, either because of insects and disease or fire, because it completely changes, their lifestyle. So I think we might want to look at whether the parcels are inhabited. Can we do that? Whether someone lives there or whether it's just undeveloped timberland. It makes a big difference on whether people are willing to spend money or hire someone, to deal with the problem, as opposed to absentee owners of small parcels who really don't have as much of an incentive. But in any event, to answer your question, I think those are the questions I had, and I do think things like using B, 1038B, it is going to be very difficult for this report to address that. Because first of all, it's hard to tell what percentage, we need to sort of get at what percentage of the large area is actually being affected. And also, there's big monitoring. It's very difficult to monitor activities on a very small percentage of a very large area. I think that's going to be a real challenge for the monitoring component of this report. But when you look at the sizes, I think that the sizes of the property that these exemptions are for emergency are being used at, maybe some of those stats will help. I'm not really sure.
We are looking at a snapshot of 2006 to 2016. That was the period we picked. And so hopefully we'll be able to get good information on trends and use over that time period. With regard to use of 1038B, we brought that question to the statisticians from PSW. We asked for help from them. Of course, their response was you really ought to do a case study approach for that. So we are. Your questions about landowners on the property using the exemption process, which I think speaks a bit to Member Delbar's perspective. I think we can answer that as well through the case study approach that we propose to use for 1038C. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some of those questions and bring some interesting information back to you.
Well, and the other difficult part with the report is not having, necessarily having a pre-exemption or emergency data. We're just looking at post. And it's, especially when you're doing things like measuring fuel depth. If you don't know what was there before you may have a net gain, you may have a net loss, or you may have no change at all. And you can't, it's going to be really challenging unless 100% of the area was affected to draw any conclusions about that.
Yeah, it's interesting, both the emergency notice for fuel hazard reduction and the modified timber harvesting plan to make fuel hazard reduction had photo point monitoring pre and post as a component. Recognizing the importance of having the pre-data so that you could actually have good evaluation once the operation was complete. And it's a bit ironic that neither one of those is used, so, so thank you. I also think it's kind of ironic I was involved in the writing of both of those.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I remember.
And I'll sit down in a minute, but we're coming to the end. I want to make sure I got my plug in for the ERCOP 3 exemption program. No more than 3 exemptions on the books at any given time.
And why 3?
Why is that the magic number?
I don't know, it's my way of thinking. I just have 3. There'll be more than 3. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll keep that in mind. One question I have, maybe Eric, you can answer is, in terms of small landowners and outreach, CFIP management plans code, 20-acre parcels, or I think you can even have 2 10 acres band together and have a 20-acre. And it's funded like it never has been in many, many years. So in terms of enticing landowners to even know what they have and the options they have, are RPFs, CLFA, the department, are we the extension, are people being the small landowners? I'm thinking of 20 to 100 acres or so, taking advantage of this. So to assess what resources they have, what they can do to invest in them, and cost share programs, besides using an exemption for monetizing dead trees or bug kills or something like that. Are we making inroads, or is it hard to find people to take advantage of that?
You're going to hear from the Deputy Chief for the Forest Improvement Program tomorrow, so you'll
you'll have a qualified answer. My unqualified answer is yes. I suspect that word's getting, but you'll hear more.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It seems like we haven't really brought up the working forest management plans at all, and we're talking about the small landowners. That was kind of what that was designed for. I know we're sort of in a holding pattern with that right now, but seems like if we could think about the exemptions in the context of that, that may actually provide some capacity for small landowners to think about this in pooled resources somehow. I don't know what that would look like, but we haven't talked about that in a while, so just want to raise that as a question, comment.
Yeah, that's up to 15,000 acres of ownerships. And then there is the potential grant program for the programmatic timber EIR for carbon as well. So we're trying to, find the sweet spot that covers a lot of the landowner base. This long-term planning, in my opinion, and management is better than a one-off short-term exemption and then forget about it. If you can do it. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to bring up it again so we capture this. When we get to the economics, no one's making any money using, just one more time, no one's making any money monetizing these usual dead trees. All it does is make it possible to possibly remove them, and I'm not sure that we really are capturing that particularly well. Regardless of landowner size, it's not, there's no profit motive in this. And we need to make sure the legislature knows that. It's just a way to cover some of the costs. I think unless there's other cases, it's just a way to cover some of the costs so that there's a chance that people will do this work.
Cutting losses.
Yeah.
Strategically, and that's a good point, and I get into the weeds a little bit, this idea of act or react that you bring forward with MPs. When I think of a 1038 drought, or something where you're responding to an emergency situation, we should push those over into emergencies because there's very little profitability on them. They need to happen quickly, generally speaking. We want to encourage those for forest health. Whereas exemptions are generally things you're trying to do preventatively, or at least the best ones are, I think. They have an ecological objective, or we want to have a resilient forest. And so because that's a preventive action, you have a little bit more time to think about it. So in my mind, well, maybe that's a 15-day review, whereas the emergency notice is, I'm going to go do this now because hell's breaking loose on my property or whatever it is. But if you divide them that way, exemptions can make money. But when I look at the exemption, I'll take my case study of my 0.67 acres in Eureka. The redwood market's up right now. I have trees that are right over the top of my house that my wife constantly wakes me up in the middle of the night. It's wet, saturated soil, that tree gonna fall on this. And so I want to take advantage of an opportunity through an exemption. I cannot afford to do it through a timber harvest plan to make my surroundings fire safe. But if I do it with the market that it is, I probably will make $3,000 to $4,000 around there. So there's a little bit of profitability with exemption, not with something else. But I think addressing that some of these things are emergency responses that may have very little financial return, or they may have, and salvage, some of them do have a return, but putting those over there versus looking at exemptions as things that we're trying to do preventatively, it's just one way that I've been playing around with strategically.
Remember Wade?
Yes.
You live in an area where there's small landowners, large landowners, dead trees.
All those things.
Bugs.
Yeah. Well, just several thoughts, of course, running through my head about some of this. And so
just to respond to your point, is that if salvage is proactive under 1038B, then can provide some remuneration. You are recovering value that would otherwise be lost. And it does help that if we have a forester that can look at a tree and say that it's going to be dead in a year, then that can be taken out, as opposed to a small landowner that doesn't necessarily have that advantage. But that is purely additive to me, because if it weren't for the exemption, just to play on a point that several have made, that's purely additive. Without this vehicle to do this, you would not be able to recover any of that. And so it would all just be value lost. And so there's that benefit. And we talked with Eric about this in committee, about that being something that, they intend to capture that concept that this is, recovering a lot of values. It does, provide all those benefits of helping forest landowners maintain their property, getting some sort of revenue, recovering value, and then that would be in addition to the safety elements and all of the things that, come into play nowadays. So I guess my general thinking about this is to go right back to Sue's initial comments that she made about trying to just follow the law, or excuse me, the PRC statute as provided by law, and try to make sure we're focusing on that first, and not necessarily get into the idea that effectiveness does reflect maintaining values that we're required to maintain under the Forest Practices Act. I think that's where we try to get to that. That would be the definition for effectiveness for me as well. When we look at the array of exemptions, I guess I keep coming back to just needing to go through these one by one and just saying, okay, that gets the Debbie's point that, they were created for a reason. And so if we were to look at each one and just say, okay, how, based on its use, based on its intent, is it achieving its goal? Is it something that we can kind of put aside and not focus on? So, for example, the Christmas tree exemption, I think everybody's, that's probably okay. I don't think anybody has a problem with that, just by way of example. The 1038B, I think, is one where we do need to drill down and try to determine, okay, how much impact are we having on the environment, given all the constraints of 1038B 1 through 10. I mean, the activities there are much constrained already. We have limitations on the size of trees that can be cut. And so do those help to address some of the concerns about potential effects on resources or not? And just, one by one going through these things, and I think we can maybe get to Eric's 3, I'm not sure, but we're probably get pretty close by just, and I think this is Demi's strategy here that she laid out does address that, but if you want to look at combining some of these or disregarding some, it's not as obsolete perhaps. So I think that's, what I'd like to see going forward, is we just focus on particular exemption vehicles as either an issue or not, or can they be combined with something similar. I think all the fuel treatment type things really should just be one. I don't see any reason why, and that's pretty obvious, I think, to most people. And so maybe the issue that we're hearing is actually about emergencies and not really about exemptions at all. I just wonder about that. If we really boil it down to which exemptions are a concern, how much really are a concern versus perhaps the emergency notice, which, can be much more impactful. But of course, you're responding to much more dramatic change on the landscape perhaps already. So, that has to be looked at in the context of what you're responding to as well. So, those are my thoughts.
That's an interesting way to approach it, I guess. Like for exemptions, which ones aren't an issue, just kind of reduce the less than 3 acre one seems to be the main one that is highlighted. And then focus on the emergency notices. That's where you need to look at removing biological risk or liabilities there, or where there's no RPF involvement, perhaps, too. It's a way to kind of screen things. So, you never start.
Well, I would like to hear a little bit more from CDFW, and the watershed talks about which, is it the emergencies that are concerning, and is it because of the intensity of the original event that, like a very large fire with lots of mortality, is that the concern? Or, in a very large area of beetle kill, that sort of thing, which results in a very large area being impacted. Kind of interested in knowing a little bit more about that, so that we can be more responsive. I guess I'd still like to try to help while you're coming up, help CAL FIRE and everybody else to produce this report in a way that will really help us with this issue, what's stimulating the concern, and how we can really focus and narrow down our response in our report to answer the questions.
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. Is it our concern more emergencies or exemptions? Okay. I think both of those categories are going to have positives and negatives. The exemptions are there for a reason, right? And it just depends on when and how they're applied. Emergencies tend to be a little bit trickier for us in the general scope of the Fish and Game Code. Under an emergency, for example, under CISA, there is no real emergency under it. So our focus again is back to the species consultation, what's going on the ground at any given time. So it's kind of hard to match when you have a program that allows an exemption under CEQA. And under an emergency, the good news, not the good news, but oftentimes you have a governor's declaration of emergency that goes with that, and will exempt CEQA from certain processes. But if you have a landowner who is doing an emergency action, and you guys approved the emergency, and then they came to us, and for some reason, they needed to later to do a more thorough CEQA evaluation or environmental investigation to comply with our CISA requirements, it puts them in a difficult position because now they don't have a THP or similar document from you guys, functionally equivalent, and then now we have to do a lead agency action through us. So that gets really tricky, really hard, really expensive for the landowner. That's just the way our code is built. I mean, there's not a lot we can do with that. So that's why we offer, consultation on some of those issues for the landowners, especially the small landowners. Our concern doesn't tend to be towards the larger landowners. They've got biologists, they've got foresters on hand, and they've got attorneys on hand, guiding them. Usually it comes down to the mom and pop type of operation, whatever you call it in terms of acreage, where they don't have that
ready guidance to be able to look at these, or those folks that really don't understand what it is that they want to do. So if you're asking what the issue tends to be, emergency versus exemption, I mean, like I said earlier, they both have their plus and minuses, they all have their issues. It really depends on who's taking it a little bit too far. In this case, we can probably clearly say that the cannabis folks might be taking it a little too far. We don't think that everybody should be penalized in less than 3 year conversion, because some folks are using it for their homes and their roads and whatever. But again, it's really hard to tell because every person is different and every landowner kind of does it a little bit differently. I don't know that I'm answering your question, I feel like I'm
What was about?
Yeah,
That was from a field perspective. Okay. Carolyn Peterson, CDFW. So with the emergencies, it really makes a difference of what your emergency is, as far as what we see on the ground and what kind of involvement we have. If you're talking about salvage logging for a large-scale fire, those are obvious. We receive consultation requests from CAL FIRE on a very regular basis for those. The landowners typically reach out to us because it is a real emergency. I mean, we need to get out there, we need to take a look at things, and it's a little more obvious. We know that there was a fire on the landscape. If you have timberland and you're going to be removing the timber, there's going to be some issues. Now, an emergency, a large-scale emergency to address any kind of dying trees, and a lot of the exemptions, we don't have any interdisciplinary review process. We don't receive those consultations on a regular basis. So it's really, and without the monitoring effort having occurred yet, it's really those types of plans that we have kind of no idea what's going on out there. So, but I do feel like the more, the higher status the emergency is, like a large scale fire, we usually know pretty well what's going on the ground, and we receive far more consultations, and I think we tend to do a pretty good job getting out there expediently and trying to help those landowners and do the best thing for the resource and get those culverts cleaned and do what we can as quickly as possible. And CAL FIRE, in my experience, has been really good about reaching out to us to ensure that Fish and Game Code compliance is part of the picture. So that's kind of my take from seeing on the ground what occurs. Is the larger the emergency, the more involved we tend to be, just because it's at the forefront. And it's a lot of the smaller projects or the exemptions that we have no clue what's going on. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I think it does.
Okay.
The less than 10% dead and dying, I think is the largest acreage one, right, in the state. And the emergency fire ones, it all depends on the year, but it's maybe the number 2 in terms of acreage. I'm just guessing. Maybe we have to salvage. Yeah.
Yeah, we're one. So under the exemption process, obviously CAL FIRE has access and does inspect these exemptions as they're active on a regular basis. Do the trustee agencies have the same access to them, or do they have to go through CAL FIRE? Same access under the exemption? No, have to go through CAL FIRE. I'm reading the noddings and
That's all CAL FIRE. So to join us in our exemptions, we have to get that landowner 24 hours notice. That's part of the Public Resources Code. However, in issuing, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, issuing WDRs, their waivers for exemptions, they probably have their own independent authority to go out and do inspections. Maybe it probably is more difficult for Fish and Wildlife because, as was discussed earlier, they don't necessarily have a direct permit. If there's no operations in the wilderness, then they don't have a 1600 permit, so it may be difficult for them.
Okay. Dave Fowler.
mention off what Dennis said. With the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, under our waiver, yes, we do have inspection authority. However, it's kind of a, how should I put it, ticklish thing, because under our current waiver, we automatically waive all exemptions and emergencies. So there's nothing that the submitter has to submit to the regional board. And so that gets into a bit of a sticky thing where they may be agreeing to inspection authority to us without knowing it, because there's nothing that they have to do. So we generally don't push the subject very much. If we were to go out on an inspection, it's usually through teaming up with CAL FIRE. In fact, every time we've ever looked at an exemption or anything like that I know of, it's always been requesting CAL FIRE.
Thank you. Mark, I want to just follow up since we're kind of wrapping up here.
Yeah.
Here's my summary of the day for what it's worth relative to the notes. I guess, that's what I heard. I feel like I heard that sentiment a lot today regarding we just don't know from agencies and from the public. And so CAL FIRE is conducting the inspections. I think we need to make sure that we reinforce that CAL FIRE has access and will access and do those inspections. How we address other agencies who have other laws and requirements that they need to make sure are being complied with, and that's something we need to delve into and think about. And I think that's an active inspection once an exemption or emergency is in place. We need to figure out what's ministerial and what's not ministerial. And if we decide this is ministerial, we don't want a bunch of people pulling it apart, and it needs to stay ministerial. And then you need to have that strong arm of the law inspecting to make sure that you're being compliant with ministerial requirements. And so I think that's a recommendation or something we need to work on there. I certainly agree with clarity and sectional organization. We talked about that a little bit forced practice, but kind of making this thing clear, because the way it's current, when you can find certain requirements under one section of 1038 that apply to other sections of 1038, and I may be doing that exemption and I'm not reading over in this section, but you can get lost in the weeds there. So I certainly think we need to continue to break down, be clear, what are the exemptions, what are those objectives, and then what are the requirements that deal with more than one exemption, and put those someplace where it's all in one place, where somebody realizes I need to read that section to know what are the standard guidelines that address more than one exemption I need to be compliant with. So we'll deal with duplicity, like that's been brought up. I have a strong affinity for the road right-of-way issue. I mean, those are the tinderboxes. We go into the Sierra foothills or into the north where people have subdivided, and you're driving up these one-way roads that are just very dangerous situations. And so it'd be nice to provide something for, I was going to say communities, municipalities, an exemption to deal with that across landowners, for somebody to organize that and some of these other programs to be able to deal with that effectively, and if there's commercial value to that stuff, be able to use that. But right now you have it around your house. As far as I know, you don't have it around your roadways once you do a 3-acre exemption. And it seems like that's something that's needed for safe ingress and egress. I don't know, Mark, if you have
For existing roads.
Existing roads, what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's hard. The road shoulders, we have to maintain it for fire safe.
Yeah.
It's hard to even deem that as timberland, because it's not, shouldn't be available for a crop of trees, right? Because it just clumps it up. But.
Well, crop a tree, that's a whole other thing. What is a crop of trees? And I think that's a workshop into itself. But
well, yeah.
But you can have miles of road, even though it's a tight shoulder, it can go on for miles, and you're driving through this area of concern. I think I think we need to.
No, I understand. Yeah.
You know, we talked about maintaining, what we decided to be ministerial, maintaining that as ministerial with all the benefits and requirements thereof. And then the final one just being the effectiveness field. You know, how do we define effectiveness? I certainly agree with what you have, CAL FIRE, relative to A and B. But I see, and it just seems to me that when they said, is this effective, they also meant, does the exemption achieve the objectives of what the exemption was originally designed for, what statute brought into being? Now, I happen to think that the reason the statutes, when you make these statutes, there's a lot of give and take about what am I trying to achieve. There's a lot of discussion that goes into that. It gets signed into law, and they say, here you go, Board of Forestry, you're supposed to have the expertise. We want you to further refine this perhaps and give us something that's going to meet this objective. So there's a certain assumption that when you get down with the rules and regulations of the exemption, you're going to meet that objective, and we either trust that or we don't. So it's almost as though you do need to test that one, as I think Chair Gill said, from the negative. Are we seeing instances in case studies where they did it, but boy, that looks like a pile of sticks waiting to burn, or some negative issues. But I'm assuming if I was a legislator, I want some professional comment from the agency, from this board, whatever exemptions we decide to keep in that package. Do we think that they are as they're being implemented on the ground, consistent with the requirements, they're achieving their intended use, or their tweaks that we need to do to those? My thoughts.
That was good to capture that.
I've got just a couple of kind of anecdotal observations, I guess. I've worked in a number of different states and even bought logs in a couple of Canadian provinces. And in California, the non-industrial private land in California is definitely less vigorously managed than the non-industrial land in any other state that I've worked in. And it's a market difference. And you know, I even in areas with kind of a comparable density of infrastructure, the non-industrial sector is still managing less intensively than in other states. That being said, in the past 3 or 4 years, we've done more business with the non-industrial sector than ever before. And some of that's market driven, some of it's fire driven, fire salvage, and some of it's drought related and mortality resulting from that. With the exception of the fire kill timber that's harvested predominantly under emergencies, I'd say at least half of the timber that we buy from the non-industrial sector, and I would say landowners less than 640 acres, I'd say at least half of that is coming through 10% exemptions, and it's kind of what they've got to use, and it's it's working for them, but it's maybe not the most ideal fit. So I think, as we go through this process, I think really focusing on what our objective is, what are we trying to incentivize, and then try to, either craft or retain the tools that help us to meet those objectives. And if we can kind of keep our eye on the goal and then tailor the tools to help us achieve it, I think that's going to help steer this in the right direction.
Good. Sorry. This is the part of it. Maybe this is where you want it, right, Kenny? Report feedback on everything. I mean, it's leading towards direction for staff, I think. I'm hoping. But
so I personally, I'd have to think about it more because I still feel like there's a lot of lack of clarity relative to the time that we have left as to like in terms of the recommendations, like what direction, where do you want, like what do you want developed, and in terms of the report outline, I'll speak a little bit.
Well, we'll get to that. I don't want to cut off this flow, but hopefully it's just keeping that in mind, what they're looking for.
And so there's 2 parts, Sunday. There's what are we going to do in the longer term? And we don't have to get that done by July. We have to get a report, not we, the royal we, have to do a report. But to me, I think one of the most important things we can do is for each, we need to parse the data out into the different exemptions, or at least subdivide them into exemptions that have the same objective. So for each if there's a group of exemptions that all have the same objective, then there should be a metric that measures, or two at the most, that measures that objective. And there isn't going to be any one metric that works for all of the exemptions. But as far as effectiveness monitoring, that's a longer term deal. And we need to just say that we're showing that we implemented the objective for that exemption and pick a measure. And then lay it out that way for the legislature, because they cannot understand. Some of this stuff is pretty in-depth and is based on long experience with these exemptions that they're not necessarily going to have, much less all the members of the board are going to have. So I would try to keep it pretty simple. And I still think there's, the primary ones, which is, are going to be hard to do, because fire hazard reduction is really not just a matter of how much fuel is left on the ground. It's also, there's going to need to be some other measure. I don't know whether it's crown bulk density, or height of ladder fuels, or whatever it is that actually takes us to a place where we know that fire hazard has been reduced through the application of this. Defensible space is a little bit different. I do think that we need to link those two things, though. The objective, what it was, what people are doing, trying to do, and a metric that measures it. And it probably, as you said, Eric, the stuff like there's just no way to go out and randomly locate plots in, where there's dispersed treatments on a really large area. So we need to treat that differently. But if we could just focus on something that we can do as well, that can be accomplished. But in the recommendations, I think we should address, to the legislature, address the further needs to do effectiveness monitoring, and some of that may need to be a part of the EMC, the effectiveness monitoring committee, because it's going to be longer term and take a little bit more of a scientific statistical approach. So that's my let's keep it as simple as possible and very specific.
Chase.
First of all, I agree with all of those points, and kind of building on that, I think this outline is a pretty good start, particularly the first 4 sections. We might tweak it a little bit as we start digging into the project, but in section 5, measure of effectiveness, at least in my mind, and this is again building a little bit on what Member Usari just discussed, but I think we ought to evaluate each exemption on the basis of, is it meeting the intended effect? I mean, is it doing what it was enacted to do? And
or we don't know.
We may not know, but as far as having a set of metrics that we're evaluating, that we're evaluating all exemptions on, it seems to me we ought to look at the intended, effect of each individual and then evaluate it on those metrics. And I agree that we ought to break, the exemptions up or group them based on that, intended effect, and then evaluate them. Maybe you evaluate these 3 exemptions, but on this set of metrics, and some others on a different set, and evaluate it that way. At least that's the way I'm kind of thinking through it. But the first, 4 sections of this, I think, are all, pretty reasonable, and a good starting point.
I like the grouping idea. I think, remember Wade mentioned the fuel treatment grouping as one big group. And I know that maybe different sunset dates perhaps. And we have the restoration objective. We have other objectives for each of them. But we can group them. It'll certainly make it easier to digest the information, I think, for a report. I appreciate this outline. In the absence of this outline, we'd be here. We'd be doing 2 more of these workshops just to even get up to this point, probably.
Do you think it would be better suited in a subcommittee or to try to thresh it out in the next 10, 20 minutes? What might be that one metric? Because I mean, I know what the intended effect is of each of the exemptions, having spent the time that I did in each of them. So like, for example, the structure protection exemption, it was to be congruent with 4290 and 4291. So what does the board want to see with regard, did we decide that was going to be a case study, or did we decide that was going to be? That's going to be a case study? Case study.
Yeah.
So, so just let's take, for example, the structure protection exemption, 1030C and 1030C6, or 1038C and C6. On a case study basis, what question do you want answered, given that the intent of it was congruence with 4290 and 4291? To create that fuel break and to streamline, make it easy for people to do their defensible space. So the question is, how have they met their defensible space?
Has the tool work to allow him to do it? It's hard, might be hard to say what the quality of the end product is.
Yeah, unless there's some evaluation that's been ongoing, it almost seems like there's no way to really, I guess the case study means you're gonna go out and look at some of them and then just do a sample and say, yeah, this meets the criteria, or this is fire safe, or, that's the problem. And so maybe you have to fall back on how many were actually implemented. I mean, maybe, there's 2 elements. There's how much has it been utilized, how many acres have been treated, and then secondly, what's the quality of treatment, and what's the perceived effectiveness under certain standard type of risk that you would have to explain or describe, in terms of so a moderate fire or whatever you want to kind of.
Well, the difficulty is, we don't tell people how many trees they have to take out. And
it's not ultra prescriptive.
It's not ultra prescriptive. So the objective generally is to produce well, first of all, is to take out enough trees that you reduce the probability of crown fire, tree to tree transmission, but then you have to follow it up with the treatment on the ground. Everybody knows this, but because we don't say you have to take the trees down to a certain density, it's entirely up to the individual to decide how many trees to remove. Is that not correct?
So that is correct, and
Yes.
that's interesting because you brought up doing defensible space. So we can look at defensible space and we can say, 80% of the ones inspected during defensible space inspections met 4291 standards. Now, did they have to remove trees or not is a completely different topic. So in terms of meeting the intent, if the intent is to comply with 4291, then we'd want to look at how many places comply with 4291. Then we'd have to look at ones that actually submitted dead, dying, and deceased and see if they're meeting the intent of resource protection and all the other things. And if they didn't meet 4291 at that particular place, then that would tell us something. But otherwise, that's a difficult one to measure because we don't tell them, usually you need to cut these trees down. We may tell them you better limb those trees up. But it's very rare in a subdivision or something like that you actually need to remove larger trees to make a place fire safe.
Well, I just meant if we were trying to measure, if people are using the exemption and they're thinning under the exemption as a preventative measure, we don't tell them to what extent they have to thin. And, the whole thing is very complicated, but I do think we can, some parsing of the different exemptions is going to be needed in your monitoring effort, but we should emphasize to the legislature that this is just a starting point for our monitoring, and there's a lot more work to do. Plus, there's so many different exemptions, and there's a lot of variables, so it's hard to get a sample that will tell you, well, you're probably finding that out. It's hard to get a sample size that will tell you very much out of that number of applications of the exemptions.
I mean, I want to know, is it achieving the goal? If not, do get rid of it. Is this one leading to environmental impacts? If so, then change it. These two duplicate, or they're just, nobody's using them. I mean, those kinds of things, right?
That really, hopefully, is how it all boiled down in the end, yeah.
But then the stage is set for long-term, data-driven feedback. And
we're also supposed to be looking at what their barriers are and somehow figure out, some of those they might not be used because there's a reason, and maybe there's a tweak to it that needs to be done to improve that so that it can be used for the purpose it was meant to be used for.
And that might be going to what, sorry, said that's a long-term goal, and we may not have the capacity to evaluate that in the next 2 months, but we can say this is a plan that will evaluate this in the next year as far as our continued evaluation of these programs, so that we don't have to do all of these things at the same time.
Well, and barriers may be things you have no control over. They may be social aspects to it. I know when I did prevention inspections, people said they wanted to keep the brush around their homes because they like their privacy. So it may not be that our program isn't effective, it's just that people don't want to use it. They don't want to buy into it for some other reason.
That's one of the data points in the ARC Collector app for the inspections, right, is whether they had an exemption to manipulate the vegetation or fuel treatment around. I mean, I imagine it is, because that's how it's all, hopefully. All that information is collected on those inspections.
Defensible space inspection. Oh, on defensible space ones?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar with how they're doing it. I know how I did it 30 years ago.
Well, it's on our collector, so it's all geospatial referenced and all data mapped that way.
So I mentioned this a couple hours ago, but I guess I'll bring it up again because, we need to crank this thing out here the next couple of months, and obviously we don't have time for exhaustive studies, but I do think it would be worthwhile reaching out to each of the units and talking to the foresters and just saying, hey, here was the intent of each of these different exemptions, and are each of these meeting the intent, and if not, why? What do you see? And we've got the numbers, we've already, put that together, now we just need some. They've covered more of these exemptions than anybody else, so I think we have to tap them.
Good resource.
Yeah, you bet.
Eric L. Cal Fire, I just wanted to respond to that, Chase, because we have been asked that question. We've been asked a lot of questions by the legislature lately about exemptions and emergencies. And we have reached out to our units in the north and south to try and capture that anecdotal picture for use in our own bill analyses. And there are limitations to that approach. And I just want to make sure we're all clear on that, because its opinion is very anecdotal, and oftentimes it's not comprehensive. And by that I mean not every unit has experience with a particular exemption type. But I agree, there's value to that. I just think it's not going to be the thing that helps us answer the questions. And my selfish perspective is we need to do this monitoring long term so that
in future legislative sessions, we can answer those questions definitively with data.
Yeah.
And hopefully guide the legislature's actions a little bit, or at least provide them with the information they need, that you need to make decisions. So, yeah, that's naive. But sure. Also, I think if we just had 3 exemption types, it'd be a lot easier to monitor them. Thank you.
So we'll just group all 20 of them into 3 types, 3 headers. So staff is recommending a subcommittee to work on this. You know, you put a lot in on this. You've been living and breathing this for a while, and appreciate the momentum and information you have in your head right now. So two members perhaps. I mean, forest practice committee and management is where we receive these regular updates from Chief Hub, but I mean, it touches all committees and all board business, you know, from RPC as well. So, I would nominate Member Shays from management. As one person. And see if we have another volunteer, maybe help Andy during the next month.
He didn't ask me whether I accept or not. I'll accept.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly interested in it, but, like, you know, if we want a broader perspective and 2 industrial representatives, is that something to consider?
I don't know anything about these exemptions, so I'm like Lila's.
Okay.
I'd be willing to help.
Okay, great.
You're gonna start doing your RMAC stuff, right?
That's right.
Because you're gonna learn about cows and.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Katie. So, not just to throw you guys into the, you know, gigantic project that it is, but I think you have an idea of what the task work would be, right, between now and Santa Rosa meeting?
Well, one of the first things is, so 2 of the work products that I anticipate being able to get out in the next couple of weeks is a simple table of intended effect of each of the, and then that can be distributed to the department, and they can distribute it as they see fit, just based on the history, the examination of the reservation files, so that can be distributed widely to get feedback. And then we'll see what the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration data will prove in terms of the harvested volume between industrials, that's something we haven't discussed, is how the exemptions are being used by the different ownership types. And so that will be available in the next couple of weeks, and we can talk about that. One thing I'm a little bit curious about, because it is an FPC right now, I believe. Okay, so, and I'm working with 2 members from management.
One management and 1 forest practice.
Oh, one management, 1 forest practice, right? So, am I preparing materials for FPC going forward, or for full?
We should discuss, we might want to do it for full, and now that we're hitting the backstretch here, we may want to have this presentation be part of the full board meeting, just what the progress is and consider.
Part of the executive report? Or
Part of the executive report.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea, because we want all throughout this process to make sure, because it's the message is in the statute that we have to, you know, make sure we participate with water boards, DOW, and the public in developing this report, so we want ample opportunities for that along the way. So,
and certainly addresses resource protection issues equally as well. So.
And then the other thing that will inform, you know, my help with the department in terms of the effectiveness, the long-term component of the report is, you know, I am being invited by the department to attend these, the next beta testing with the interagency effort for the long-term monitoring. So I'll be able to at least, make sure that I'm not saying something in conflict with the effort that's going on there. So I think it was worthwhile.
I'm not sure we got what you needed out of it. But it seems like we did hear a message of keep it simple where we can and not get too tangled up with where we don't have information that would lead to just inconclusive, mishmash or whatever.
Well, the other thing, Debbie and Dr. Henley's here, I really think we should make the connection to the effectiveness monitoring committee for longer term effectiveness monitoring and re-examine whether some of, I don't think we really focused on the exemptions and emergencies for validation yet in the questions we've asked of and put out, as research proposals. So we might want to make that connection because that's really a good source of people and the connections to the universities for effectiveness monitoring in the future. More than the implementation monitoring, which is what we really do need to get underway soon too.
And that Pacific U exemption, that's still in the books. That's gone. That was just a history.
Yes. As was that less than 3 acre
Right.
timber operation.
The one that led to.
Or the fire
lawsuit.
lookout emergency.
All right.
The fire lookout emergency.
So we have gotten rid of some.
Not down to 3 yet. I'm gonna miss the train.
All right, well, productive workshop. And
Yeah. Not ready yet.
we're ready to conclude this workshop and Board meeting tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Adjourned.